it is financial services, insurance, software design, creative industries, that there is where the future lies for our young people. And they are already embracing those new industries, and we run the very real risk that our market for those new industries will be chopped down just as it starts to bear fruit. And thirdly, this deal provides no guarantee that the UK will continue with key educational, scientific and other research programmes. Ipswich has one of the fastest growing economies in the UK, and that growth is in many of the same sectors as the current success story in Cambridge. That is put at risk by any block, either to our ability to sell knowledge-based products or to the free movement of those engaged in research and in the economy. Mr. Speaker, all of us need young people in the UK to be able to share and learn from each other across Europe. Otherwise, what developed knowledge-based economy are we going to have? Where is the money going to come from to support us in our old age? We can't all live on dividends from offshore investments. I do not believe that there is enough in this withdrawal agreement to mitigate the appalling damage that will be done to our future by leaving the EU without a deal. I might say, for an incoming government.
I just want to look forward 10 years from now and see what position our country will be in if we have a deal, or if we vote for the withdrawal agreement, as I intend to do, and have a deal along the lines of the political declaration. And I believe we will see a country in which we've implemented the result of the referendum, that we will have almost certainly, and I'll come on to that in a minute, broad and comprehensive agreements with the European Union. We'll have probably agreed free trade agreements with many other countries, including those that we don't have at the moment. But there is, of course, uncertainty in that. There's uncertainty in every course that we are going to take. Indeed, there's even uncertainty if we stay in the EU. We don't know what the EU will be like in 10 years' time, how much more integration will have occurred. But in the long term, Mr. Speaker, our future is going to depend far more on proper investment in the education of our young people in this country, in an approach to immigration based on skills and not on salaries, on ensuring our universities thrive, and on investing far more than we have done, even while members of the European Union, in capital and in research. But one thing I know, Mr. Speaker, is that I cannot, under any circumstances, support a no deal. As my honourable friend for Thanet described on Tuesday the consequences for his constituency, and my right honourable friend for Sevenoaks yesterday said no deal would be highly irresponsible. Having visited myself the port of Dover, Honda at Swindon, Toyota last week at Burnaston, spoken with Jaguar Land Rover, a very important employer in my part of the world, and seen the dependence on frictionless trade, I absolutely agree. But, Mr. Speaker, one thing is really important, and in fact my honourable friend from Stoke-on-Trent Central mentioned it earlier. This is more than just about a trade deal or a future relationship. This is about investing in our communities, the communities that have been left behind, that we have ignored on both sides of the House, and I would say ourselves over the last 8 years. And it's time that we got real about it. It's time we had almost like a Marshall Plan for the United Kingdom to get us into a position where we can thrive and compete in the 21st century. And to be honest, I don't think our membership of the European Union is as important in that. All those decisions will be made right here in this House. But finally, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say we have to work together across the House to ensure that whatever happens on Tuesday, and it looks very much like that this is not going to get through, certainly on the vote on Tuesday, we have to work to get an agreement so that we do not leave without a deal next March.
Thank you. Ruth Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Stafford. Mr. Speaker, like my constituents, I am fed up. Too many people in the House have felt it appropriate to play political games with real people's lives over the last 3 years. I voted Remain, I campaigned for Remain, and like the minority in my constituency, I believed that staying in the EU was the best option for the country. But I lost. In fact, I represent the third most Leave Labour seat in England. I didn't lose because my constituents were thick or racists. They aren't. They just disagreed with Remain voters on what the future direction of the country should be, as is their right. And candidly, Mr. Speaker, I am fed up with people patronising my friends and neighbours because they don't agree with some of the voices that are currently shouting loudest. My constituents voted in overwhelming numbers to leave the European Union, and they had good reason. They feel no benefit of our membership in their day-to-day lives. In fact, for 40 years as politicians, we have blamed Europe for decisions that we in this House could have challenged. So why were we surprised that the majority of the country voted against remaining in the EU? We therefore have a responsibility to deliver that for them, while seeking to ensure that we achieve a Brexit that works for them and for the country, and most importantly, one that protects the next generation. So I want to vote for a deal. Crashing out with no deal is simply not an option for the country or for the Potteries. So I have waited patiently for the Prime Minister to deliver a deal that I could vote for. I've waited for her or one of her team to reach out to these benches and ask what the world needs to look like in our communities after Brexit. To ask what we need to do to deliver for trade, for industry, for jobs, for people to make this work. Mr. Speaker, I am still waiting, and my constituents need to know. We need detail, and we need it before we're asked to take a leap into the unknown. We need certainty on the economy. We need reassurance on our sovereignty. We need guarantees on our national security. We need to know what our immigration framework is going to look like. We need assurances on the immigration status of EU residents in the UK and UK residents in the EU. We need protections on both the environment and workers' rights. But what have we got? A withdrawal bill that speaks of fishing more than jobs, a future plan that isn't binding, and a proposed deal that neither secures the Brexit my constituents thought they were voting for, nor protects our long-term trading future. How offensive is it to this place that we have no guarantees on any of these issues less than a week before we're asked to vote? Mr. Speaker, my constituents and I are left between a rock and a hard place. What's in front of us is a withdrawal deal that is rightly overwhelmingly about process. But the Prime Minister has failed to remember who she is negotiating for. For 2.5 years, we have been consumed by process. She has forgotten about the people who are struggling to pay the bill. The Prime Minister forgot us that so fundamentally we're here to make people's lives better. So it is not a surprise that my constituents do not think that this is a good deal. In fact, less than 20 of them have asked me to support it. So, Mr. Speaker, while I am far from comfortable with the uncertainty that would exist when the bill falls this week, I cannot, in all good conscience, vote for a deal which leaves so many unknowns for my constituents. I beg the government to try again and give us more reassurances about the next steps for Brexit and our place in the world, so we know where we're heading when we do leave the European Union on the 29th of March.
And Giles Watling.
My honourable friend from Stoke-on-Trent. Like my right honourable friend from Mid-Sussex, I was a Remainer, but I am a Democrat. 72% of my constituents voted to leave. And oddly enough, 10 months later, some 60-odd% voted for me. But they did that because they thought I'd be part of a government that would deliver on their wishes. Now, the withdrawal agreement does tick so many of the boxes that was demanded by the British public and my constituents in 2016. We regain control of our borders. We protect jobs. We'll no longer be sending vast amounts of cash to bolster the European budget. And we'll be able to strike free trade deals across the globe. Hurrah! Like many others, I have serious concerns about one particular thing, and that is the backstop. And I know, having spent most of the last fortnight speaking to residents in my area, I held an open meeting, which was quite rumbustious last Saturday, and these are concerns that are shared with my constituents. But we all know that the Attorney-General conceded earlier this week that there is no unilateral right for either party to terminate the backstop. So if no superseding agreement on our future relationship can be reached during the transition, the backstop would be activated and would subsist even if negotiations break down. So what has been the point of the last 2 years of uncertainty and pain if, in the final analysis, we will still be under the dominion of the European Court of Justice. That, to my mind, is not taking back our sovereignty. And that is why I have tabled Amendment D, which will make the House's approval contingent on the government negotiating absolute guarantees within the withdrawal agreement to ensure that a deal on our future relationship is in place in full before the transition ends. Such guarantees would negate the need for any backstop. I do, of course, recognise that under Article 184, both sides are required to use, in inverted commas, best endeavours to conclude an agreement as far as possible before a transition ends. But while this means that both sides must do everything in their power to reach an agreement, it does not impose a strict legal obligation. Now, some may say that the transition period is not long enough to conclude such an agreement, and I disagree. And the government concurs with my stance. The Secretary of State said that it is the government's ambition to have a deal concluded by July 2020. Now, that will be a challenge, no doubt, but our negotiating teams have already achieved far more in a short space of time than any of us, or quite frankly, have given them credit for. So I am of the firm belief that a deal is durable during transition. And after all, we all want to do it on both sides of the channel. Therefore, in tabling my amendment, I simply ask why we cannot have a guarantee that this agreement will be signed, thereby circumventing any backstop. Evidently, both sides are happy with best endeavours. In my view, best endeavours aren't good enough. They aren't cast iron. So to conclude, I hope that colleagues will support my amendment, and should this deal fail to pass the House next week, I hope that the government look closely at securing these guarantees. Moreover, I believe this change would also address the fears of my constituents and those highlighted by my colleagues during this debate. And we would at last get this agreement over the line and find a way forward that delivers on the result of the referendum. So the good people of the Sunshine Coast of Clacton want a good deal. So let's get this deal done and move towards a brighter future. Thank you.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member. In his introductory remarks, the Chancellor made clear that leaving the European Union will have an economic cost. And that is right. Any deal of any kind will be putting us economically as a country in the worse place than the deal we currently have as members of the European Union, its single market, its customs union and its frictionless trade. For our financial services sector, which is so vital for our country and especially for London's economy, this deal does virtually nothing. And therefore, we have a dilemma. Now, it's fashionable to say that the British people didn't vote to be poorer. But if you look at some of the opinion polls at the moment, it seems that around 35% of our people are quite happy for the country overall, but perhaps not they themselves personally, to be poorer if we get some great independence and sovereignty. Well, can I say to the members who've referred to this issue earlier, the United Kingdom is already today inside the European Union, as it has been since we joined the European Economic Community and then the European Union, a free, independent state, along with the 27 other free, independent states who voluntarily associate together to make the collective rules with a democratic internal process represented in a Council of Ministers, represented in a Commission and with elected members of our national parliament and of the European Parliament. We still remain an independent democracy as we have been for many, many years. And therefore, this false comparison of the EU and the Soviet Union, which is put out by the ultra-Brexiters, has really got to be taken on and dismissed. And similarly, I want to say this is the worst time for our country to be leaving the European Union. If the deal is agreed, there is this political declaration. The political declaration says we are not going to be in the European Defence Agency, we are not going to be in the European Defence Fund, we are not going to be in the permanent structured cooperation, but we are somehow going to aspire to not participate but be involved in some indirect manner. Not in the room, not even in the corridor outside the room, but perhaps occasionally associated with things that the EU does. At this moment, the UK and France together are the most important contributors to European defence within the EU states. We are going to move out of that. We are also going to cease to be an EU state in the cooperation that goes on in the United Nations. We will still be on the Security Council, but we won't there, with France, be a voice for the other 27 in Europe. This is a very bad deal. I will vote against it, as I voted against triggering Article 50 and for all the measures to mitigate the damage. Ultimately, we have to have a choice, put this back to the people, this deal, or remain with the deal we have now within the European Union.
Through.
Speaker, for the opportunity to speak and contribute to what is probably the most important debate of my parliamentary career. In the time available, I want to explain why, on balance, if the terms of both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration remains the same, I will be supporting the government when Parliament votes on the deal next Tuesday evening. Whilst I personally voted to remain in the EU, at the time of the referendum results and at the subsequent general election, I did commit to fully honour the will of my constituents, who voted 62% to remain, 60% to come out and 38% to remain, and my commitment to my constituents has not changed. And my decision whether the deal is the right deal or not has not been taken lightly and has only been reached after many conversations with my constituents and also reading through the many emails and other correspondence I've had also from my constituents about the deal in its different formats over the last few weeks and indeed since the referendum result came out. Local businesses in my constituency, such as my many upholsterers in Long Eaton, have also urged me to back the deal. They need to ensure that they can continue, for example, to get their fabric from Europe in a way that it doesn't affect their business, and for them it's their livelihoods. The upholsterers in Long Eaton employ in total over 2,700 people with a turnover combined of over £250 million, and that's from just about 50 small businesses. And this is so important to the town and the future of Long Eaton. The heart and soul is in the upholstery business in that town. But all my local businesses, whether small and large, want and need the uncertainty to end. They just want to get back to normal, and the consumer confidence will return. It will secure jobs and trade and continued success, not just for my constituency, but for the whole of the UK. And I fully accept that the deal may not be perfect in every single way. However, the very nature of negotiations mean that both sides must be willing to give and take. But what about the alternatives? The case for a people's vote has been advanced by some to try overturn the decision of the British people. And I would argue that it would not only be undemocratic, but also risk dividing our communities even further, and perhaps irreversibly. Others have argued that the no deal would be an option, but this is a deal that quite rightly the government continues to prepare for, but really we do not want, we should not have to go down that route at all. Because once again it will affect our trade and our future prosperity. But for many of our constituents, what they increasingly see is a political class that has become so entrenched in our own idealistic visions of leaving or remaining that we run the risk of losing their faith in this Parliament. So my appeal to members across the House is to end the political games, reflect on what the consequences of rejecting this deal would be, then let us unite and reunite in what really is in the nation's best interest. And I talked about my small businesses in upholstery, but I've also got large businesses either in my constituency or on the edge of it. And one business that in total across the UK and Ireland, they employ 17,750 people. And they say, We ask you to give us the opportunity to build upon Brexit and make it a success and vote the Prime Minister's deal through to give us the clarity we so badly need. I know my other local businesses employ lots of people at Rolls-Royce, Bombardier and Toyota on the outskirts of mine, where a lot of my constituents work. Echo that as well. So in conclusion, Mr Speaker, with my head and my heart, I believe that we do need to support the government for the future prosperity of our nation.
Diana Johnson.
Mr Speaker, Hull is full of hard-working, patriotic people, an outward-looking port city, trading every day with Europe. And in 2016, we voted to leave the EU by over 60%, and that was for many different reasons. But the one I heard the most was that feeling that our country could do better outside the EU, taking back control of immigration and much else. At least, how could it be any worse? We have lower than national average life expectancy, lower wages, lower investment in transport and infrastructure, higher unemployment and fewer opportunities. And as the Shadow Chancellor said in his opening remarks, Hull people felt and feel ignored and left behind. And so the Leave campaign's promises were so attractive. Why not vote for £350 million a week extra for our NHS, or the promised billions for our ailing railways, or a renewed fishing industry? And my near neighbour, the MP for Halton Price and Howden and the former Brexit Secretary, promised there will be no downside to Brexit, only a considerable upside. However, having a simplistic binary choice in the referendum for determining our relationship with a complicated and complex set of institutions has resulted in confusion. Although my constituents voted to leave the EU, there is little clarity on exactly what they voted for, but all of them voted on the basis that they would be better off and their families would be better off. So as a Democrat, I voted to trigger Article 50. However, the preparations made to leave the EU, or the lack of them, and the conduct of the negotiations have been wholly the responsibility of the government. And while so much was made of the role of this sovereign Westminster Parliament, government has fought Parliament every step of the way to have a meaningful say in this most important issue. And the Prime Minister has boxed this country and herself in by a rigid timetable and red lines on the single market and customs union. I cannot support the deal before us today because I sincerely believe that it will not ensure that my constituents' lives will get better. They will get worse, nor will it give us back control. The vast majority of Hull North voters who've contacted me about the Brexit deal want me to vote against it, including most Leave voters. A decade after the global banking crisis and the years of resulting austerity, we now face the real danger of destabilising our economy for years to come. The promises made to my constituent about how straightforward it was going to be have not lived up to the reality, and the government has spent largely the last 2 years negotiating with itself. And the Prime Minister describes the political declaration as a set of instructions for those negotiating after we leave. Surely the weakest position to be in to negotiate from. So specifically, there's no agreement on frictionless trade, vital to a port like Hull. The promised fishing deal hasn't been done. On security, there's no agreement after 2020 to be part of the European arrest warrant or access to the EU criminal databases. There are concerns from pharmaceutical companies about access to drugs. There are concerns for UK students about studying in Europe. There's concerns about visa-free travel. There's concerns for university and NHS recruitment and access to research. We are being sold a pig in a poke. Corrosive uncertainty will go on for years. We won't be better off. We have more years of negotiating deals and, under this agreement, taking rules from the EU. So rather than being boxed in, Parliament now needs to look at all the options. We have stood alone as a country before, but our country has survived and thrived by building alliances around the world, and this deal does not do that.
Thank you. Sir Hugo Swire.
Mr. Speaker, no one ever said it was going to be easy. I never shared the lofty visions of the founding fathers of what was the EEC, the EC and the EU, Schuman, Adenauer, Monnet and others, and I totally understand where they were coming from in a post-war, post-consensus Europe and what they were trying to achieve. But I never shared a vision of wanting an ever closer federal a set of European states, a European army. I'm pleased, as de Gaulle always knew we were going to be, that we were awkward members of the club. We maintained our own currency, and so forth. But we had a failure of understanding and a failure of negotiation when my friend, the former Prime Minister, went to talk primarily to Chancellor Merkel to try and persuade her that he needed to be given something to bring back to the United Kingdom. She, I think, did not quite understand the predicament he was in. Nonetheless, during the campaign, I voted to remain. I voted to remain because I believe that the EU, with the UK as part of it, was immeasurably stronger with the United Kingdom as a moderating force. I questioned as to who would benefit from a weakened EU, and I still maintain that is Russia, and if you're living in Sweden or the Baltic states, I have no doubt you would share that view. Yeah. And as a former Northern Ireland minister, I could not quite understand how we could do with the issue that I was sure would come up as to the Northern Ireland border. My constituents, Mr. Speaker, in East Devon, by a small margin, voted to come out of the EU, and I respect that view. Nationally, 1.3 million more people voted to come out of the EU, and we must respect that view. I have been perturbed and variously alarmed and horrified by the way our negotiations have been conducted over the last few months. How we could have agreed to pay a sum of up to £40 billion without securing an agreement, I do not know. And I hope my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will look carefully at an idea of having a Brexit bond which we can pay the EU with, which is linked to the cooperation of the EU with us to ensure that our economy actually prospers. Normally, as a former Remainer, the House would expect me to endorse this vote that we are having next week, but I find that I am currently unable to do so. Why? Because of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the withdrawal agreement. I cut my political teeth, Mr. Speaker, as did my right honourable friend, the member for Mid-Sussex, who made such a good speech earlier, as indeed did you, sir, in Scotland as a Conservative Unionist candidate. I was served in Northern Ireland as a Northern Ireland minister. And you're not denying it, Mr. Speaker, but I think you did fight a Scottish seat, unless I'm entirely wrong.
Order, just stop the clock. I did in 1987, but I've not the slightest recollection of expatiating on the matter of the European Union, and certainly, by definition, I couldn't have done so on the matter of the withdrawal agreement. Sir Hugo Swire.
You did. I was just suggesting you cut your teeth there, and I think I was right in that case. And all my experience in Northern Ireland, I know the nervousness of the Loyalist community about how often they're treated by both the Northern Ireland Office and the Foreign Office, both institutions in which I have served. But I do not think we can possibly place part of the United Kingdom in a position which is different to the rest. It is an appallingly dangerous precedent. And I say to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who I salute for even just standing up at this stage, I say to her, I beg her, try and get us some movement on that part of the deal. If you do, you will find that there are those like me who will feel able to support it. If you do not, you will find yourself short of votes next week, because there are those of us who put the Union and the integrity of the Union above all other matters.
Steve McCabe.
I want to make a contribution to recognise the wishes and fears of people in Selly Oak who took part in the referendum, to acknowledge all those who've contacted me, offering sincere advice, opinions and sometimes threats about how I should vote. And I also want to thank everyone who's taken part in my surveys as I've attempted to understand this in the context of the needs of my constituents, a majority of whom voted to remain. Actually, 2 wards voted to remain and 2 voted to leave. I've always accepted that people took part in the referendum in good faith, and we should try to acknowledge the overall result, even if it's extremely uncomfortable in a constituency like mine. But what I can't accept is that people voted for the deal which the Prime Minister is now trying to represent as the will of the British people. We're much better informed now about the implications of Brexit than was the case during the referendum. We also know more about the behaviour of the Leave campaign, which casts a shadow over the result. I admire the PM's stamina, and I don't envy her the impossible position she was bequeathed. But the reality is that her offer is the deal that doesn't deliver. She promised to make us stronger, but it will make us poorer. She promised to end free movement, but expects us to vote without even sight of her immigration plans. She promised cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism while opting out of vital security arrangements. The answer to every question is the political declaration, a fudge, the very kind of fudge unacceptable to all those who want to leave. The reality is we'll continue to be subject to the European Court of Justice, but lose our right to participate and have a say. We'll lose access to the Schengen database. It's a deal which may give the illusion that we've left, but every leaver knows that as far as it's concerned, Brexit doesn't mean Brexit under this deal, and every manufacturer and exporter must realise that this isn't the frictionless trade they're seeking. It's a political declaration where the obligations have yet to be addressed. In other words, without guarantees on jobs, exports, businesses beyond the transition period, or the questions for higher education, research and health. It's a real pity the Prime Minister spent such little time trying to build bridges across this House and so much time trying to placate the extremists and shoring up the interests of our purchased DUP majority. We've reached a stage where we can have no deal, a very poor deal, or a genuine review of what people want. I'm not going to vote for this because it doesn't give any guarantees to my constituents. Leavers don't really leave and they'll be poorer. Remainers end up associate members of a partnership where they once had much better rights and deals, and they'll end up paying and taking rules without getting anything like the same in return. I think she ought to set up an all-party commission. Let those of us of goodwill who want to work together to see if there's something we can salvage from this, do it. Stop telling people that this is a deal that delivers when it doesn't. Stop pretending that that referendum was some definitive judgment. Stop pretending about the manifesto commitments, and let's try and get a deal and then put that to the British people and let them decide.
Colin Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise to remind people that it was only 2 months ago that there was a debate on the legislation of the withdrawal agreement. And then I listened to the DEXU Minister saying that we were looking for a smooth transition to a comprehensive future economic and security partnership for business and citizens. Mr. Speaker, it was admirable, it was convincing, and it recognised the 2016 referendum. Now, I argued on that day that we should be looking for a free trade arrangement, maybe a Canada Plus arrangement, and I did so because I believed that was actually deliverable. The Prime Minister has said she was more ambitious than that, and we now have a different deal in front of us. Industries in my Gordon seat have embraced Brexit. They have prepared for change. They have considered the solvable problems of Brexit, and they are doing this, Mr. Speaker, in good faith. And today we get to consider supporting this withdrawal agreement fundamentally because of good faith. Now, I asked the Chancellor yesterday at a committee if we had prepared in 2016, could we have had regulatory and certification preparation in place for WTO rules? That at least would have given us a realistic backstop to negotiate from. However, industries in my constituency, the oil and gas majors who employ 280,000 people, farming, food sector, tourism, financial and service sector, they need us to behave like grown-ups. They need us to recognise they need a deal which works for businesses and jobs. The Bank of England has run comprehensive stress testing, which the Chancellor recognised earlier. And the good news is that under every circumstance, under every scenario, that our financial system is safe and robust. And as I said to the Chancellor earlier, in future negotiations, we should be extremely robust with the EU. Now, the stress tests were not forecast, and I've heard many members on the other side say how damaging it will be to our GDP. But I'd like to remind them why this country is the second highest destination of foreign direct investment. It's the top 10 freest market in the world. It has a legal system and a rule of law that people want to be based in this country. In the first half of 2018, it was only China that had higher FDIs than the United Kingdom in front of the US, Singapore, Hong Kong, Spain and Holland. This is a country people are investing in now and will invest in the future. And what are the upsides if we do get an agreement with the EU? The foreign exchange has discounted the pound so significantly we could see a currency bounce. The stock market today is in fall again because they are concerned about no deal. And as a business person, I recognise that concern. There is pent-up investment in the system of potentially of hundreds of billions of pounds as companies have held back. And Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, I can support this because I support the Brexit vote. And being a Scot, I have been involved in another referendum. And parties on the other side seem unwilling to recognise that people have spoken, and I democratically believe in what they have said. Please do.
Would my honourable friend not agree with me that yet another referendum, as you mentioned referendums, would cause greater degrees of pain, uncertainty and delay when what we need to do is actually move on?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and particularly in Scotland, where we saw the SNP reject the independence referendum, and we call another one. We don't need that uncertainty. We don't need our people back at one another's throats. We need some sort of stability, and we need to be able to move on. Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, this comes down to good faith, and in the words of the Attorney-General, the risk must be weighed against the political and economic imperative on both sides to reach an agreement. And I absolutely agree with that. We shouldn't listen to the siren voices. Let's not cast ourselves on the rocks. We should be a confident country. Scotland and the whole of the Union demands better. The United Kingdom demands leadership, backbones and guts. And frankly, if you're faint-hearted, you should leave the stage. I will show good faith, but there will be an enormous price to pay, Mr. Speaker, if we are being duped. So let's win 4-3 and deliver Brexit. I will support the government next Tuesday, not out of blind faith, but for the good of this country, the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. An honour and a privilege to be participating in such a historic debate, but given the time limit, I'll drive straight in. Let me start by saying what an utter disgrace it is that the government tried to hold back its legal advice from Parliament on a decision of such magnitude, and we now know why. With regards to the backstop, it clearly shows that Northern Ireland has been sold out. The government has lost the trust not just of the DUP, but the wider British public. They have reneged on their solemn promise. The House had to force ministers to change their minds and release the legal opinion. What an utterly ridiculous situation. This whole Brexit process has been blurred, botched and bungled from the very start. Has ever so much diplomatic and political capital been expended for so little result? With every passing day and each resigning minister and each international snub and rebuff, it has become ever clearer that the Prime Minister and her team, and I use the term lightly, are not up to the task. Her entire negotiation tactics, as has been illustrated by honourable and right honourable members before me, has been to the appeasement of hardliners within her own party. I need hardly remind the House that this kind of craven acquiescence on the part of her predecessor is the reason why we have been landed in this entire mess in the first place. Instead of patiently assembling a cross-party alliance, a coalition of support for her plan, the Prime Minister has created division and discord. And the social and economic consequences will echo long after the votes have been counted. And this is an issue, Mr. Speaker, which has been exercising many within my constituency who are very, very anxious indeed. Since the publication of the agreement, up to yesterday evening, I have received scores of emails from Slough constituents, more than 94%, imploring me to vote against the Prime Minister's deal. I think that is fairly emphatic. I am a supporter of the EU. I wanted the EU to remain in the EU, and now I want us to have a very close and collaborative relationship with our neighbours. And the world's economy has never been more interconnected, more dynamic, and that's why as nation-states, we must form alliances to ensure that we have a very strong and stable relationship going forward, hopefully a lot more strong and stable than this crumbling government. Now, after 2 years, we face a much more dangerous situation, and of course it is not just a matter of macroeconomics and geopolitics, it's a matter for real families, real businesses and real working people. When I meet business leaders in my Slough constituency, they tell me the same things, that businesses need a stable economic environment, a backdrop, but this withdrawal agreement leaves businesses facing years of uncertainty. And when I talk to trade unions in my Slough constituency, they tell me the same thing. The government's deal tears up decades of negotiated deals around workplace safety and conditions. And many on the benches opposite actually oppose the European Social Charter in the first place and would happily see it scrapped. And that's why the likes of myself cannot see, as we've already heard in the debate, that this crumbling government is their own analysis, by the way, Mr. Speaker, shows that the economy will be 3.9% smaller. And many of us can now also not afford the hard Brexit and amendments that have been tabled, which I fully support. And also, I cannot support the government's withdrawal agreement. I think that the party opposite have failed spectacularly to deliver Brexit, and that's why they must stand aside for a general election.
If you had said to me, Mr. Speaker, that a year and a half after I was first elected, I would be standing in this place in order to rebel against my government, I would have been extremely surprised. But it is testament to the problem that we have in front of us today and the gravity of the issues which we are dealing with, that is exactly what I intend to do on Tuesday. We have a decision to make. There is too much calculation in this place. There is too much overthinking. We are obsessing about single commas when entire paragraphs do not work. This deal does not work from a trade perspective. It does not work from a law perspective. It does not work from a backstop perspective. And it does not work from a money perspective. And I cannot support it. Like so many of my colleagues in this place today, I have nothing but admiration for what the Prime Minister has done over the past 2.5 years in order to try and get us to the place where we are today. But hard work is not an end point in itself. Resilience is not an output. Stamina is not a strategy. And we have to understand the proposition which is in front of us. And that proposition is very wanting in its current position. One of my very close friends in this place, who is not here right at this moment, said to me a few days ago when we were talking about this, I did not come to this place to make my constituents poorer, and neither did I. So we can both agree on that prospectus. But when you move all of the facile, nonsensical debate about estimates out of the way, some of which has been touched in a largely good-natured debate today, we are actually talking about what is good for our country in the long term, the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I do not want to make my country poorer, and I know what will make my country poorer. What will make my country poorer is the inability to sign meaningful trade deals. It is the inability to be flexible, to take advantage of the global growth which is coming outside of the European Union. And I know what else my country will be poorer from if this deal goes through. It will be poorer from a democratic perspective. I represent a constituency which voted 63% to leave. And I cannot go back to my constituents in Claycross and Killamarsh and Eckington and all of those other villages who voted overwhelmingly to leave and say that this deal delivers Brexit. It does not. I disagree with this deal. I disagree with this deal because of where we have come from, because it is a failure of negotiation. I disagree with this deal because of where we are, because it is a failure of nerve. I disagree with this deal because of where we are going. It is a failure of ambition. Stop this deal, stop this discussion, have the confidence in our country, and move us out from the shadow which we are under, and understand that we have a much brighter future if we want to grasp it.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Dame Louise Ellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In June 2016, 73% of my Liverpool Riverside constituents voted to remain. The European Union has been pivotal to Liverpool's remarkable transformation. But many people across the country voted to leave, believing that that would make them better off. And now, 2 years on, it is clear that they were sold a false prospectus. We are now urged to accept the deal in front of us, but beyond the transitional stage, there is no certainty, there is no deal. It is a political framework urging the parties to work together in good faith. There is no certainty about frictionless trade, which is absolutely essential for just-in-time businesses and people being able to get the medicines they need at the time that they need them. There is no certainty there will be any trade deal with the EU. There are no trade deals with the rest of the world agreed or anywhere near agreed. And there is a massive cut to financial services, a 6% hit, with effects on pensions and insurance. So what should we do? Accepting this deal would be highly irresponsible. Leaving without a deal, the government's alternative, is inviting disaster. There could be more negotiation without the Prime Minister's red lines. If the House can agree a way forward, that could be explored. It could be problematic, and whatever solution it reaches will be worse than the current deal we have as members of the European Union. Or we could go back to the people and tell them the truth that we cannot leave the club and keep all the benefits. That is mission impossible. We are told that people will be angry if they are asked for their opinion again. I think they will be angrier if we vote knowingly to make them poorer, and they then face even more rising prices, fewer jobs, and less money for public services. Surely we should give people the option to remain in the European Union with the knowledge that we now have. It's time for a referendum, time for a people's vote. Let the people decide.
Simon Clark.
Mr. Speaker, reflecting on the debate in this House and in the country in recent weeks, I want to open with the words of Sir Winston Churchill in 1934. All down the centuries, one peculiarity of the English people has cost them dear. We have always thrown away, after a victory, the greater part of the advantages we have gained in the struggle. The worst difficulties from which we suffer do not come from without, they come from within, from the mood of unwarrantable self-abasement into which we have been cast by a powerful section of our own intellectuals. They come from the acceptance of defeatist doctrines by a large proportion of our politicians. Nothing can save England if she will not save herself. If we lose faith in ourselves, in our capacity to guide and to govern, if we lose our will to live, then indeed our story is told. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, what has characterised these negotiations has been exactly that spirit. The government has approached Europe as a supplicant, accepting a series of conditions which have led inexorably to this place. At the heart of this lies the backstop, and I will not rehearse the arguments which have been echoed this afternoon about why it simply does not work. What I will say is that our own ministers, the Irish government and the EU alike have all made it clear that under no circumstances will there be a hard border in Ireland. And if this is a prison, it is a prison into which we will lock ourselves if we sign up to this deal. Despite the government's best efforts to convince us otherwise, the EU clearly want us in the backstop, and why wouldn't they? They would have total control of our trade and customs policy. They would have our 39 billion. They would have ensured we cannot outcompete them through level playing field provisions, and they could offer unilateral access to our economy and their trade negotiations with third countries. This must be rejected. It may be that our doing so will finally prove to the European Union that, as the Prime Minister long insisted, no deal is better than a bad deal. And I continue to believe there is a better deal to be done. But we must also face the possibility that this may not be possible. In that case, I am very clear we should leave on the 29th of March next year on World Trade Organization terms, in accordance with the EU Withdrawal Act. And I do not say that lightly. It will require courage and resolution, as well as a dynamic policy response that should include exciting ideas like free ports. For reasons that are bewildering to me, the government has failed to initiate serious preparations for this scenario when there was good time to do so. That was not due to negligence. Rather, it was a conscious policy, lest, God forbid, the Europeans understood from our making those preparations that we really were resolved to leave in earnest. That has been a lamentable failure, and must change, and change now, for every day is of value. And this must be accompanied by a wider change of policy. If this deal is rejected by the House, as I hope it will be, the ghosts of Project Fear must be exorcised. They have offered bad counsel for far too long, seeking always to reduce the path of negotiation to a minimalist and apologetic legal separation, rather than a great nation setting forth into the world. My final words are to those colleagues who will seek to prevent such a clean Brexit through amendments which have been tabled to this effect. I would simply say to them, think well upon it. Without that ability, we truly would be hostages to fortune, choosing only between the skiller of a bad deal and the Charybdis of a second referendum. This last, I think, would do untold damage to people's faith in democracy. People in forgotten parts of Middlesbrough and in forgotten parts of East Cleveland voted to leave. They still want to leave, and they want to leave properly, preferably with a good deal agreed in honour, but if necessary, trusting in our strengths and resolved to succeed as a global free-trading powerhouse.
Susan Ellen Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow members and honourable members in this debate. I think, like many of my constituents, I stand here extremely worried at what has developed. I think we all are practically certain the Prime Minister will not get her deal through next week unless something quite extraordinary happens. But I am aware that as I vote against that deal, I will be voting against with some people who are voting against for very, very different reasons. And I have no truck with the ghosts of Brexit secretaries and foreign secretaries past who act as commentators and simply refuse to accept that the sunny uplands of which they speak, they refuse to accept that it is where we are now is anything to do with them. And as I vote, I have no sympathies for them whatsoever. Now, today's debate is on the economy, and I believe our economy and our jobs must come first. I've had many emails and letters and phone calls from constituents, and they are very worried. I think I am worried too. And that is, I'm worried because, according even to the government's own economic forecasts, the UK economy would suffer under all forms of Brexit. When such a prestigious body as the National Institute for Economic and Social Research tells us that the Prime Minister's deal versus staying in the EU would leave UK domestic product falling by £100 billion annually, that is of concern. And just for those who think these sort of projections are no more accurate than reading tea leaves, let's go on to some real figures. With economy down from the fastest growing in the G7 in 2015 to among the slowest now, with only Italy slower. And when the pro-Brexit chief economist of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Julian Jessop, admits that the UK economy has probably grown more slowly due to additional inflation prompted by sterling's fall, that concerns me too, and it worries me. When the TUC rightly make the point that with the PM's deal, even during the transition period, workers would see a reduction in their rights, as the UK government has suggested that new rights with an implementation period after the transition would not be brought forward in UK law. Mr. Speaker, my constituents and I are concerned. Wales's First Minister Carwyn Jones has rightly noted that Wales receives £600 million a year from the EU, and that we export 60% of all goods to the EU. I am very, very concerned, and I cannot support a deal that would make my constituency of Clwyd South in North Wales, Wales and the UK poorer. In the words of the former Universities Minister who resigned from the government on this issue, the brutal negotiations we will go through will make us poorer and less secure. Now, I believe on one thing the Chancellor is right. All of this has left us with a very, very divided nation. I know from my post back, I hear from people who voted leave in 2016 and from those who voted remain. And I think, to be honest, I cannot represent all of them adequately. So what I will say is this. There are 55,000 plus people of voting age in my constituency. I, on Tuesday, will have a right to vote in a meaningful vote. I would like to see each of my 55,000 plus voters have that same right in a people's vote. And I would like that not just for the constituents of Clwyd South. I would like it for every single voter across Wales, every single voter across the UK. Let them all have a meaningful vote now. We have a meaningful proposition. Let the people's voice be heard. If we cannot get a general election, that must be our course of action.
Graham.
Mr. Speaker, I want to argue for the inevitability of imperfection, the lack of credible alternatives, the value of compromise, and above all the benefits of safeguarding the interests of our constituents. So let me start with the deal and its imperfections, many of which have been listed by colleagues around the House. Above all, concerns that the backstop arrangement to prevent a hard border on Northern Ireland could lead us into an indefinite purgatory of neither in nor out, with rules from the EU governing aspects of our trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And clearly, if the government can give further reassurance on this point, there are many colleagues on all sides of the House who would be relieved. But the deal does something else. It balances honouring the result of the referendum, looking after citizens and their and our rights, and not damaging business and jobs or the security of our nation. And for both those of us who voted Remain, because, as I wrote at the time, the short-term risks outweighed the potential longer-term benefits, and for those who voted Leave in order to bring back control, this bill does mitigate the risks, gives certainty to people, trade and security, and allows us the chance to shape opportunities that may come forward in the next stage of the negotiations on detailed trade and customs arrangements. And for my constituency, Gloucester, with our engineering and manufacturing heritage, our aerospace and nuclear interests, our growing cyber sector, and the contribution made by our academics and health specialists from the European Union, this compromise may not look heroic, but it is practical. Let me make three other key points. The first is that flaws in negotiations are as inevitable as the weathered stonework on Gloucester Cathedral. As Churchill reputedly said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And so it is with this deal. Those who criticise the deal because it does not satisfy them, either because it does not have a close enough relationship with the EU or it is not distant enough from the EU, effectively are offering one of three alternatives: no deal plus WTO, a Labour renegotiation, Norway plus, or a second referendum. Let me brush aside, I'm afraid, the concept of a Labour renegotiation from the party whose only position has been not to have a position, resolute only to be irresolute. On the second one, the second referendum, this, I believe, would be the only genuine betrayal of the promise to every household before the referendum that what you decide, we will implement. And Norway plus, however defined, which may become a place of refuge if this deal were rejected, the House should be in no doubt. It is not a good deal. We would pay a lot to be a rule taker and never have an independent trade policy. So for those of my colleagues from representing seats from Uxbridge to North East Derbyshire who rail against the deal, the challenge is this: show me your better deal. And do not risk what you wanted, Brexit, by now demanding everything from a negotiation that will never be achievable. Because, and this is my last point, our constituents want to see this deal done. They want us to move on and get back to what they want to focus on: better care, less knife crime, easier transport, good broadband and excellent public services. In the Civil War...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from that point, and at this late stage, having sat here for many hours waiting to be called, I can't help but be reminded of Oliver Cromwell's words on dissolving the Long Parliament. You have sat here too long for any good you are doing. But nevertheless, we carry on. For MPs like me, Mr. Speaker, for MPs like me who joined this House in 2017, there has always been the backdrop of Brexit and the one great matter that lay ahead after the referendum: how to respect the result in a way that doesn't trash the economy, but that does bring the country back together again. And one that unites our nation as it was so memorably in 2012. When the world admired our Olympics and we all glowed with pride at what we had done and the country that we had become. That feels like another century, not 6 years ago. And all because the Prime Minister has squandered every chance she had to make a Brexit that brought us together again. She came to power, let's face it, on a wave of goodwill, because she stepped up when others didn't. But that has now evaporated. In Croydon Central, hundreds of people have sought me out to tell me their views, and just 6% of them support her deal. Meanwhile, those burning injustices that fired up many Leave voters still burn hotter than ever. This is a deal which the government knows will make us less well off, and yet it has ploughed on regardless. Parliament itself has been ignored and infantilised during this process. Appearances at the dispatch box or in select committee have been used as a kind of parliamentary cowpole to keep the babies quiet. This is all on her. She promised too much, prevaricated too often, and listened too little. If it was up to the Prime Minister, we wouldn't even be here having this debate and holding the executive to account, but that is what we are here to do. We have a national picture of stagnating growth and tumbling investment. And what this government has done, and what this deal will carry through, is hollow out the drivers of a strong economy. A strong economy needs to be incubated in certainty. This government has overseen a £22 billion gap in business investment compared to pre-Brexit trends because of its chaotic negotiations, and this deal simply offers more uncertainty. A strong economy needs world-class infrastructure to rebalance growth and stop our busiest cities grinding to a halt. This government has not tackled any of the problems of failing rail companies and things like that, and this deal threatens future infrastructure funding and delivery. A strong economy needs people with the right skills and education. This government has cut billions from schools and colleges, and this deal jeopardises important programmes like Horizon 2020 and Erasmus. A deal that resolved those issues is one I could happily support, but I cannot support a leap into the dark for my community and my local economy. Our first priority must be to drive a stake through the heart of any notion of choosing a no-deal Brexit. The 15,000 businesses in Croydon are terrified of no deal, and we can't shrug off plans to commandeer ferries, stockpile medicines and put the army on the streets. So government must now step up. The executive needs our guidance, even if it won't ask for it. Our economy for decades to come will be defined by the decisions we make in the coming days. We can move towards the certainty our economy needs to attract investment and be a global player, towards a closer, more stable relationship that keeps standards and rights high and our sights higher. And we start by voting down this deal.
Andrew Bowie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in this debate as someone who lived and worked in Brussels, in the EU bubble itself, whose wife and by virtue nieces are EU nationals, who voted Remain in June 2016 and who represent a constituency that voted convincingly to remain in the European Union. And for quite a long time post the referendum, I did wrestle with my conscience over whether supporting the government's decision to pursue Brexit was the right one and whether it was true to what I had believed. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I never for one moment doubted that this country could survive and thrive out with the European club. This is the fifth largest economy in the world, an enterprising, dynamic, inventive and confident nation, a union of nations of near unparalleled and continuing strength and influence with interests and allies far beyond this continent. The point I wrestled with was why it should have to choose between being prosperous within or out with the certainly imperfect European Union. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple fact that I came to realise pretty early on, and that those who argue for another referendum or argue for Brexit to be halted in some way have to remember, is that the decision was taken in a people's vote, in the biggest democratic exercise in the history of this country. And the decision of the British people, a people we are all here and elected to serve, was to leave the European Union. My point, Mr. Speaker, is that I understand how many of my colleagues on these benches especially feel right now. I know that on these benches many of my closest friends and colleagues are struggling to come to a decision on how to vote next Tuesday. They are wrestling with their own consciences, as I did, and I know they are doing so as to come to a decision that they believe will be in the national interest. It was John F. Kennedy that said, "A nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its own people." Mr. Speaker, the people judged and the people voted, and now we must honour the result of that judgment and leave the European Union. And it is up to us to implement that decision, and our duty is to do so in a way that is supportive of business and that will cause least upset to the economy as possible. And so, as the Member of Parliament for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine, as a Scottish MP, I stand to say that I back the agreement brokered between Her Majesty's Government and the European Commission. I don't do so lightly, and I do not do so because I believe it's the best outcome for business, for my constituents, and indeed for Scotland. And I do not do so because it's an easy choice, but because I believe it is the right one and is in the national interest. And it is a deal supported by the National Farmers Union of Scotland, the Scotch Whisky Association, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, CBI Scotland, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, who know a little bit more about fishing than some honourable member sitting opposite, and Sir Ian Wood, who said, "I frankly think we do need to move ahead." It's what you hear most business people saying right now. I think the proposal that's on the table, I think it is workable. I think it's better than we have right now. We are out of the common market membership, but we are maintaining some of the advantages. And I think it would be a great dereliction of duty on my part if I did not listen to these voices.
Would he give way?
I would be delighted to give way.
He's making a very powerful case. Does he agree that actually all representatives of different sectors in Northern Ireland have also been very supportive of this deal, whether retail, industry, manufacturing or services, and that's something that should be taken into account?
I thank the my honourable friend for that intervention, and yes, I do recognise that point. However, I don't think it's incumbent on me to speak on behalf of Northern Ireland. I would leave that up to members who are elected here from Northern Ireland to speak on behalf of them. I'm speaking on behalf of my constituents and what I think is in Scotland's best interest. So I think Scottish MPs have a duty to do what's in the best interest of the Scottish people and the Scottish economy. And I say to my colleagues from Scotland on all sides that it's now time to stand up and be counted. For the sake of our economy, for the sake of this country, I think we have to back this deal, back the government, move on together as we continue to build a Britain that is united, stronger, and that is genuinely fit for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was and remain a very firm Remainer, but nevertheless I voted to activate Article 50 because I wanted to respect the result of the referendum, and after that my responsibility is to secure what I believe to be the best outcome for the United Kingdom and my constituents. Although I must say that the more I hear about not just the lying but also the manipulation of data and the cheating in the referendum and now allegations of foreign involvement, the less I respect it. We also hear about that the Prime Minister is deserving of our respect for the negotiating of the deal and now the continual promoting of it in the face of certain defeat. But for me, again, there is nothing to be respected about knowingly and deliberately driving the country off the edge of a cliff. Because from the old government's own assessments, this deal will make the UK worse off and our people less prosperous and less secure. So I cannot praise the Prime Minister for what amounts to a kamikaze approach in the face of clear evidence of impending economic damage, particularly damage to our manufacturing sector, with a lack of certainty over the hopes of frictionless trade. Right from the outset, the Prime Minister has muddled and misrepresented. When she called the snap general election in 2017, she stated the country was united, but Parliament was divided. She was entirely wrong. The country is more divided than ever under her leadership. After the general election, she might have reached out across this House to find support for the least damaging form of Brexit, although every form of Brexit is damaging. Instead, she chose to tax the hard right and seek the sole approval of her own Brexit fundamentalists in the ERG. Yet these extremists will never and have never been satisfied. You can never throw them enough red meat, as Sir John Major himself discovered. This left the Prime Minister high and dry, clothed solely in the meaningless sound bites and slogans that have been the hallmark of this process. And indeed, I remain unclear as to where or when the point was at which her slogan, "No deal is better than a bad deal," morphed into "a bad deal is better than no deal." But a bad deal is what we have now. It makes us follow rules without making a say in those rules. Again, I'm tempted to say that that would always have been the case if we were going to leave the EU, but still want to trade into that market while meeting the standards that that market demands. There's no solution in the agreement to the question of the Irish border, largely because there is no solution possible that also respects the Good Friday Agreement, aside from the UK remaining in the EU. We're told that technology will provide a solution, but as usual, this is an empty soundbite. There's no technology available now and no clue to what it will look like in the future. It could be, Mr. Speaker, that one day technology will find us a cure for cancer, but that's no reason for me to start smoking now. Honourable members will need to decide which is more important to them: continuing peace in Northern Ireland and maintaining the integrity of the United Union, or leaving the European Union, because certainly under this deal you can't have both. Areas of business have publicly stated their support for the Prime Minister's deal, although leaked CBI emails demonstrate their true feelings. But all this deal will offer is 2 years of stability during which they can up sticks and move to another part of the European Union. So we have to reject this false choice of the Prime Minister's deal or no deal and start to chart our own route away from the ideological choice of Brexit, which is a simple one of do we want to be aligned with Europe with its basic decent standards on food safety, consumer protection and rights at work, or do we try instead to align ourselves with deregulated, privatised, Trumpist America? The simple choice is there, and those are the only two options on the table. And well, it's absolutely the case, and I won't take any heckling from the right honourable gentleman. So we need to address concerns over free movement and the exploitation of migrant labour by bad employers, but there should still be an option to remain within the European Union and negotiate a much better deal than David Cameron should ever come back with.
Well done. Thank you. Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have seen the EU firsthand. Bureaucratic, one-size-all approach, which can feel so out of touch. And if those other EU leaders had shown more empathy for the negotiation by David Cameron, then perhaps we would not be where we are today. But I've also seen the EU doing good. I helped negotiate the changes we needed to international banking law after the financial crisis, the changes we needed to international gun laws after those terrible Paris attacks, that massive fund for science and research. I even helped end mobile roaming. I campaigned for Remain in 58 Westminster constituencies, in 40 public meetings, in radio and TV debates in six counties. I think I remember what people were told. People were told their vote mattered, the result would be respected, and we today should respect that vote. A second referendum is not the way forward. I think it would be even more divisive and no more decisive. I gave 3 reasons for voting Remain: the single market, security and science. The EU is our largest trading partner, and many people's jobs depend on that trade with the single market. New trade deals with other countries will help, but leaving the EU with no deal poses a huge risk. And every time I said that, the Leave side said, don't worry. They promised we would get a deal because the Germans want to sell us their cars. When people voted Leave, they were told they would not be voting for a no-deal Brexit. The withdrawal agreement helps real businesses to avoid real cliff edges and gives time to finalise that trade deal. The future framework offers the potential for the deepest trade deal that the EU has ever offered and the deepest partnership on security. And as for our scientists, it allows them to continue to participate in those international networks they need. Some colleagues say we should opt for other models, but Norway leaves us a rule taker on services as well as goods, and the EU and UK often have different priorities on services. Norway means delegating regulation of financial services to the EU. It hands over the keys of the Bank of England to Brussels. It does not work for the UK unless an alternative option for financial services is given. A can of diversion will result in borders, and it does not provide the frictionless trade our advanced manufacturing sectors need. And then, of course, there's the plan from the party opposite, this close deal with the single market, but without the competition rules or state aid rules. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm a Harry Potter fan, but the plan promised by the party opposite is fantasy fiction unicorn land. Now, I grew up in Northern Ireland. I'm a unionist. There are concerns about the backstop becoming permanent. But to me, this is a legal risk. It's not a practical risk. A permanent backstop is not in the EU's interests, and it would be challenged in the European courts. I know other European leaders are watching this debate closely, and I hope they're considering what more they could do to help address this concern. But, Mr. Speaker, there are three options. I'm okay, actually. I will conclude, because there are three options. This deal, no deal, or no Brexit. And because of the lives and livelihoods of my constituents that I was chosen to represent, I will be supporting the Prime Minister's deal when we vote.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a real privilege to hear the contributions made by MPs today, because I think what we've got a real sense of is just how different the issues are in each of our constituencies, just how varied our nation is, and in some cases how divided our nation is. But what there is absolute unity on in this place is that this deal is just nowhere near good enough, and it's certainly not a deal that I'm going to vote for when I'm casting the vote for people who live in Oldham, Western Royton. That's not why I've been sent here. I've been sent here to try and secure the best possible economic and social advantage for the people that I represent, the people that I live amongst in my community. And I've got to say, throughout the negotiations, there's been no effort made to reach across and to create a consensus, not necessarily about the future relationship with Europe, although that's important, but to actually address the underlying tensions that led to people to vote leave in the first place. The mass deindustrialisation that have left many communities without the decent, well-paid and secure jobs to provide a future for themselves and their families. The hollowing out of public services that meant that people have been left with 1% of the cake, and they're now fighting for the crumbs amongst increased competition. When they can't get a decent house, or they're fearful of the education in the local schools, or they can't get access to the local GP or the local hospital. Why? Not because of Europe, but because of choices, deliberate, targeted choices by the Tory government, who then wonder why they lost the EU referendum. And it was a shock. That's why, in the document that was published by the government that was sent to every house in this country, there was no mention of what an alternative deal would be. There was lots of concern, there was lots of caution being applied, but there's no alternative being offered in there. And the other thing that there wasn't in this document was a single mention of Northern Ireland. Not a single time was Northern Ireland mentioned in the official booklet that went to every household in this country. And let's be honest, had it not have been for the foolish calling of a referendum, of a general election in 2017, we wouldn't even be discussing Northern Ireland today, because it'd be an afterthought. The only reason why it's important now is because the Tories need the DUP to secure them in government. And that's completely fallen apart. Now, I just say this: thank God for the people of Ireland, on both the Republic and the North of Ireland, that we're now discussing this, because we've seen such a cavalier approach to that hard-won peace in Northern Ireland for every community that lives in Northern Ireland, that seems to be like it's a token. It can be traded away as if it's not important. You know, I really wonder what condition this Parliament is if it is so willing to cast aside those legitimate issues. When I speak to people in Oldham about the things that matter to them, what they want to know is, what does the future hold for their communities and for their family? And isn't that the cruelty of Brexit so far? That at a time when we needed leadership, and for the Prime Minister and for the government to say, this is what Britain can be, it's been nothing but absolute soundbites. And who's it been left to? Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, claiming to be the voice of the working class. How ridiculous is that? The only time you see them lot on an estate is when there's hunting rights at stake. But meanwhile, there's communities that are being left unexploited, and they'll be exploited again unless this Parliament gets a grip of this. I voted to trigger Article 50 because I respected the referendum, but the way it's been handled has been a national disgrace. The Prime Minister will lose this vote. She's not been able to unify this House. And so what lessons can be learned? The first fundamental lesson is, don't divide but unite. reach across the chamber and secure a better deal. I believe there is a better deal, but I tell you what, it requires better negotiation than we've seen so far.
Aaron Lee.
My constituency of Lincoln voted to leave the EU whilst I voted to remain. We are united in fighting for a better future for Lincoln outside of the EU. I do sincerely believe that there's a Brexit deal which will benefit my constituents and Lincoln's business and tourist communities. A deal which protects jobs, the economy and our rights. We need a transitional period based on the same basic rights as we have now, a single market, a customs union with the EU. But to ensure that we have a sustainable, prosperous economic future, we must negotiate a new comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure we have no tariffs with Europe and that we have control of any new trade deals. This will benefit the manufacturing industry, which is central to Lincolnshire's economy. Local companies need frictionless trade deal to maintain supply chains and have access to the European markets. However, the Prime Minister's proposed agreement attempts to ensure trade is as frictionless as possible. And the government's own forecast suggests the value added to the economy by the manufacturing industry will be reduced by as high as 2% under the current deal, and a no-deal scenario may decimate the sector by 12%. For those working in Lincoln's manufacturing industry, we must guarantee that our country does not fall behind the EU in workers' rights or in protections for consumers and the environment. We don't hear a lot of that from the other benches. But this deal will not protect jobs, workplace rights or environmental standards, and it will inhibit businesses by failing to ensure frictionless trade or any certainty about our future relationship with the EU. The political declaration does nothing to ensure market stability or to encourage increased investment in the UK. The longer this instability continues, the more likely businesses are to leave the UK. We have the Bank of England telling us that the Prime Minister's plan will see the economy shrink by 3.75% compared to the pre-referendum trend, and the National Institute of Economic and Social Research telling us that the deal could lead to our GDP losing 3.9% of growth, which equates to around £100 billion in 2016 prices. Money which could be better spent on our devastated public services. Yes. Mr Speaker, I am very proud to represent Lincoln today, a place which was close fought in the referendum but chose to leave. Prior to deciding how to vote, I surveyed my casework to assess what Lincoln thinks about the PM's deal. A very large majority, both Remain and Leave voters, have asked me to vote down this deal, acknowledging that there are alternatives before we meet the no-deal cliff edge. We can renegotiate with the EU, or better still, hold a general election. Many of my constituents acknowledge that a successful Brexit is contingent on replacing this shambolic government. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has spent the last 2.5 years trying to solve the squabbles within her own party, instead of focusing on trying how to get a good deal for this country. And that is why, at such a late stage in negotiations, we have such a poor deal in front of us. Mr Speaker, it simply isn't good enough, and this country deserves better. And if the Prime Minister simply cannot deliver better, she should stand aside and make way for a party who will.
C. MacDonald.
Very much, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister says it's her deal, no deal or no Brexit. And in response, my constituents are saying resoundingly and overwhelmingly no to Brexit. If there wasn't already an institution like the European Union, we were desperately trying to create one. Rooted in the aftermath of the bloodiest war ever fought, forged through decades-long Cold War, it is an extraordinary thing to witness now the extent of the cooperation and wealth creation between nations that within living memory were hell-bent on destroying each other. Such an international and supranational institution, built on a framework of human rights, democracy and the rule of law, is essential for the times in which we live. Supranational issues such as climate change, terrorism and extremism, Russian influence, and the challenges of globalisation require a supranational response. And we can maximise our potential in trade and research, in education and science, and harness the benefits of globalisation much more expansively through membership and cooperation than by acting alone. It's about independent nation-states not giving up, but pooling their sovereignty and powers for the greater benefit of all. The tragedy, Mr Speaker, is that in the UK, too often the EU has instead been used as a scapegoat for all our ills and a soft political punchbag, right the way back from Harold Wilson claiming to save Britain from Euroloaf and Euro beer, right down to the former Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, talking nonsense about bananas and hoovers. Of course the EU is not perfect, but ultimately, perhaps with the exception of Presidents Trump and Putin, few would fail to accept that its existence is a wonderful thing, a good thing for the UK as well. And if you think that the existence of the EU is in the UK's interests, which I think everybody would agree, then it strikes me almost as a dereliction of duty to say we are not going to be involved anymore. But, Mr Speaker, what this boils down to is that every single Brexit scenario, including the Prime Minister's deal, leaves us worse off than if we remain in the EU. Worse off materially, but also worse off in terms of opportunity, security and influence. So, Mr Speaker, I am not going to vote for a deal that deprives my constituents and future generations of the same benefits and opportunities that my generation have enjoyed. And if the best thing that the Prime Minister can say about our deal is that it ends free movement once and for all, then it is a rotten deal. Finally, Mr Speaker, what Brexit has also done, as my honourable friends have highlighted in recent days, is again flagged up the hopelessly lopsided nature of the United Kingdom, which will always and inevitably dominated by its biggest constituent part. And it has provided a stark contrast with how a small, independent country like Ireland can command genuine support and consideration at the heart of the much larger group of EU nations. While Scotland has been sidelined, Ireland has been front and centre. Mr Speaker, I dearly hope the UK will step back from the brink of the disaster that is Brexit, but the very fact that we've even come this close shows to me, as never before, why Scotland should forge its own future as an independent nation-state within the European Union.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. It's clear that the Prime Minister's deal is dead in the water, so it's imperative that we now turn our thoughts to the alternatives. And in doing so, we must ask ourselves a very simple but vitally important question. What did the 52-48 mandate actually instruct this House to do? And the answer to that question is clear. It was a call for Britain to leave the EU's political institutions and project, whilst maintaining the closest possible economic relationship with the 500 million consumers on our doorstep. It was an instruction to move house, but to stay in the same neighbourhood. So the fundamental question is this: how do we convert that mandate into practice? Well, first we must seek a general election. But if that is not possible, then we must pivot immediately to Norway Plus. Many people refer to Norway Plus as a Plan B, but for me it has always been Plan A. For 2 years now, I've been making the case for an EEA-based Brexit because I believe passionately that it offers an exciting future. It would enable us to be a leading light in a group of like-minded European countries that sit outside the political institutions of the EU but enjoy full participation in the single market. It would also enable us to reimagine and reinvent our relationship with Europe. European leaders are now recognising the limitations of the EU's one-size-fits-all approach to integration. President Macron, in particular, is a strong supporter of the concept of a multi-tier Europe that better reflects the different histories, cultures and political temperaments of its component parts. Importantly, Norway's Prime Minister and Iceland's Foreign Minister have also confirmed they would welcome us into the EEA, whilst Michel Barnier has made it clear that from the outset the EEA plus a form of customs union was always on the table. Some are concerned about our ability to control immigration in the EEA, but Articles 112 and 113 of the EEA Agreement enable any EEA country to suspend and reform any one of the 4 freedoms that underpin the single market. Yes, the EU could take retaliatory measures, but these actions would have to be both proportionate and in accordance with the original Act. Norway Plus would also solve the Irish border issue because Single Market Plus Customs Union delivers frictionless trade and is therefore currently the only realistic guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. Mr Speaker, my party's frontbench amendment calls for a permanent customs union and a strong single market deal. Well, I have to say that sounds like Norway Plus to me. If 6 tests and our frontbench amendment clearly set out the what, well, Norway Plus provides the how. If our front bench were to adopt Norway Plus, it would become the flesh on the bones of Labour's Brexit policy, but it is because it's the only plan that offers the certainty, clarity and security of leaving the EU via a well-established, well-understood and fully ratified international treaty. By committing to Norway Plus, we would be underlining the fact that we're not only an opposition, we are a government in waiting, with a constructive, realistic and workable proposal that is truly in the national interest, that can clearly command a cross-party majority in this House and that can dig us out of this constitutional crisis. Mr Speaker, our country is not only polarised, it is paralysed. Communities and families are divided, and Parliament has fought itself to a standstill. As politicians, we desperately need to start building bridges. Having campaigned for Remain, I can see the attraction of a people's vote, but I can also see the risks. What would it say about our fragile parliamentary democracy if we just throw this back to the public? Mr. Speaker, call me old-fashioned, but I still believe passionately in parliamentary sovereignty. Our constituents are crying out for us to do the job and solve this problem. A Norway plus-based Brexit would be a strong compromise in the national interest, and it's only by compromising we'll get ourselves out of this mess. It is only by doing this that we can reunite our deeply divided country.
Ronnie Cowan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The famous Greenokian Chick Murray told this story. He said, "I woke up this morning when my alarm bell rang. I switched it off, went back to sleep. And then my doorbell rang. I got up, I went to the door, there was nobody there. I crawled back into my bed, I was falling asleep, and my telephone rang. I said to myself, this is one of these days when everyone's going to go wrong." Hansard will show that laughter rang round the chamber, unconstrained. Ladies and gentlemen, Brexit, the day when everything goes wrong. And that is the many people fear. Over the last 2 years, a number of local companies have written to me expressing their concerns. Over the last 2 weeks, the quantity of these emails has increased alarmingly. Businesses and organisations are now acutely aware that with only 113 days to go, they are still being asked to plan for the unknown. I've heard the term just in time thrown around this chamber with great gusto, but I honestly wonder how well it is understood within the Cabinet. If a manufacturer or producer is operating a just-in-time process, then they're doing so to streamline production. They don't want large stocks of components or ingredients. They want to receipt it into production, consume it and move on. They don't want to have to stockpile inventory. That would tie up cash, and in business, cash flow is crucial. Just ask Carillion. And given that they currently run just in time, they don't have the required storage space, especially true if this involves refrigeration units, and their computer systems are not configured to handle transactions from non-existent warehouses. When Commerce became aware of the potential issues of the year 2000, many spent large sums of money and undertook comprehensive changes to avert disaster. I repeat, there are 113 days to go and we still don't have a plan. We do have a range of outcomes, but nobody can write an effective IT system if the design is constantly changing. And as we've heard today, this evening, these concerns seep into travel, transport, medicine, education, and the list goes on. Brexit has challenged this Parliament and this Government to be innovative, courageous, responsible and entrepreneurial, and it has failed, failed, failed and failed again. Brexit has shown this Parliament and this Government to be not fit for purpose. And maybe, just maybe, that is a lesson we will take from Brexit. In Scotland, we draw strength from the knowledge that we can do something about it. We can create our own future, free from the incompetence, conceit and chaos of Westminster. And yet every time we ask about Scotland's priorities, Scotland's options, Scotland's unique opportunities and how they can be protected, we receive the same stock answer. The people of Scotland voted no in 2014. This translates as Scotland has forfeited all rights to its needs to be recognised as a sovereign nation. Well, this Parliament should be careful with its language, because when we say taking back control, we mean it. Thank you very much. Kate Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This deal fails on so many counts. It doesn't give us back control. It doesn't give clarity and certainty. And it will do nothing to heal the divisions that so many honourable members have talked of that now pertain in our country. I find it particularly ironic that we're being told that one of the virtues of the deal is the certainty it will give to business. It does no such thing. After the transition period, the political declaration's vagueness means that business can be no more certain than ever. and in my constituency, home to the first and I think still the largest industrial park in Europe, this is a matter of the utmost importance. Businesses in Trafford Park span a vast range of industry sectors, all of which will be affected by the nature of the way in which the country leaves the European Union. Sectors like food processing, chemicals, paint, fire-resistant product manufacture, furniture making, printing, service industries and logistics. Those businesses have no guarantees from this deal of future frictionless trade, no idea of what the long-term customs and tariff arrangements will look like. Those businesses have no idea of the long-term regulatory regimes that they will participate in, and they have no certainty about their access to European labour. It is quite disgraceful, Mr. Speaker, that days before we are required to vote on this deal, we still do have no sight of either an immigration bill nor an immigration white paper. And the lack of access to labour in industry sectors like food processing, like construction, like social care, like hospitality, like retail, all of which are crucial in my constituency and in the constituency of many honourable members, leaves a gaping hole that make it impossible for us to vote for this blind Brexit. I'm very fearful that this deal will not only compromise our future prosperity, our future security, but it will diminish our standing and influence on the world stage. It is incumbent on us to find something better. And something better cannot be no deal, which would take us down a black hole of no security arrangements, no trading arrangements with our nearest neighbours, no capacity to deal with the challenges that we face on a global basis of climate change, conflict and population movement. Parliament can now try to find a common ground, a deal we can all agree on, but I fear that, as with the country, Mr. Speaker, the evidence that this Parliament may now be hopelessly divided. An election delivering a new government with a new will to negotiate a deal that benefits the whole country is something I warmly look forward to and will welcome. But may I say gently to my own front bench that if we are in government and negotiating a deal, will have to be realistic about the compromises that will need to be made if we are to be able to continue to benefit from a relationship that works with our European Union neighbours. And if nobody in this place can draw up a satisfactory deal, and increasingly, Mr. Speaker, that looks like it will be the outcome, then I too, after a long period of soul-searching and as a fundamental believer in parliamentary democracy, believe that we will have to return the decision to the country.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Dulwich and West Norwood voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union in June 2016. The vast majority of them were devastated by the referendum result, and there has been no subsequent reduction in the level of engagement from my constituents on Brexit, nor their palpable distress and concern. I made a firm commitment to represent the views of my constituents on Brexit. Their views are very clear. Overwhelmingly, my constituents do not want the UK to leave the European Union. I will continue to put that view on record for as long as this process continues. Although passionate in their beliefs, my constituents also understand the catastrophic risks that a no-deal Brexit presents for our economy and security, and are clear that this must not be allowed to happen. Many have watched the approach taken by the government in its negotiations with the European Union closely, hoping that the government would negotiate thoughtfully in the national interest, intent on bringing together a nation divided by a close referendum result. They have looked carefully for signs that the government was working for a Brexit deal that demonstrated that ministers had listened to and reflected their concerns, albeit in the wider context of something that they wish was not happening at all. 2 years on, however, it is clear that the Prime Minister has failed catastrophically in her Brexit negotiations. It is also clear that the seeds of this failure were sown at the very beginning, in the speech she made in Downing Street, in which she declared Brexit means Brexit. Brexit was not clearly defined at that stage, but this vacuous statement allowed the Conservative hard Brexiteers to move in and claim the definition for themselves. Soon afterwards, setting out her red lines, it became clear that the Prime Minister was allowing the hard Brexiteers to go completely unchecked and to have a role and influence which was grossly disproportionate to the views of the country as a whole. Instead of establishing a set of principles and objectives for the negotiation which sought to build unity in a country split down the middle by Brexit, and instead of being able to see that this process would have implications for the UK which transcended party politics, the Prime Minister sought only to appease the extremists within her own party who hate the European Union far more than they are concerned about the potentially devastating economic consequences of leaving it for communities up and down the country. The Prime Minister's approach to Brexit has also failed to acknowledge that the wider global context has changed since the referendum, not least with the election of Donald Trump as President of America. The reality of a volatile, inconsistent, protectionist US President is a de facto weakening of any hypothetical opportunity to benefit from a new trade deal with the US. Any trade deal with the US already ran the risk of being a race to the bottom on environmental protections and workers' rights. The Trump presidency introduces further risks that could not have been imagined, still less debated, in June 2016. The importance of our trading relationship with Europe has therefore strengthened, not diminished, over the past 2 years. The Prime Minister's deal is also fundamentally unstable. It is her deal and hers alone. The Henry VIII powers established by the EU Withdrawal Bill allow the government to make fundamental changes to the legislation we currently derive from the EU. So there is every risk that the Prime Minister could quickly be replaced by a hard Brexiteer who would undermine the deal by the back door to deliver a much harder Brexit. I cannot vote for a deal which has such a strong risk of paving the way to an even more damaging hard Brexit. If the Prime Minister's deal is defeated, she should resign and call a general election. If Parliament will not vote for a general election, then I believe it must allow the people the opportunity to vote on whether to accept the Brexit deal on offer or whether to stay in the EU. This is not undemocratic, it is more democratic, and it is the right thing to do.
Thank you. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this debate has progressed, the limitations of the Prime Minister's deal has been exposed. We've witnessed the process where Brexit has come to mean this Brexit charade, where transparency and accountability has been dodged and has had total disregard for the very concerns people had when they voted. My interpretation of the vote on the 23rd of June has always been that our country divided. We can argue that there were more in favour of leave on a particular date, but politics shouldn't be about a race over a finish line, but in reading the Times and hearing the multifaceted and complicated reasons for people making their choices and then seeking to resolve those concerns raised on all sides. As it happened, my constituency in York voted overwhelmingly to remain. I respected my constituents and believe it was my duty to reflect their vote here when it came to Article 50. And rightly, I couldn't trust the government. Leading up to the referendum, we must all remind ourselves of the febrile political environment and some of the worst xenophobia and racism propagated across different media. We will recall the financial pressures that were levied on our constituents, the cuts so severe, jobs insecure, opportunities denied, and many struggling. Over the last 2.5 years, people across our nation would have expected the government to have reached out and responded to the causations that divided our country. The government have failed. My constituents live in the most inequitable city outside of the capital. Since the referendum, the cuts have deepened, with the worst funded schools, one of the worst funded health services, crime is up, good jobs have been lost, and constituents and businesses alike feel seriously let down. The casework I deal with, quite frankly, is so shocking, it's heartbreaking, and I struggle to believe that we live in a so-called society. But with this economic analysis released last week, things will get worse. None of us came into politics to make people poorer, but this deal will. My excellent universities in York, which have an exemplary reputation across the EU due to the success in winning EU research projects, will lose out significantly, as will our local economy, which is already struggling to find people to work in the hospitality sector and in the care sector, caring for our most vulnerable. I was flabbergasted to see that the government still, after 2 years of uncertainty, failed to recognise how business needs time to plan and work with the markets it has to relate to. So further uncertainty only adds risk to our economy, not least over future customs arrangements. As a negotiator, it is plain to see that you need leverage in negotiating a future deal, and the political declaration also provides no such security. Worse than this, we all know that industry and services have lost confidence in our great nation due to this government's Brexit framework and are slowly and steadily sliding across the border into the EU, further weakening the government's position. But my test, Mr. Speaker, in the light that the nation voted and was divided, is how the Prime Minister has demonstrated that she has the capability through her deal in uniting our country. This deal does not achieve that. People didn't vote just on technicalities with institutions, but the wider context of their lived experience at this time. Politics is not just transactional, it's all-encompassing. Labour has an agenda which will address inequality, division, poverty, and will end austerity. It will heal our broken nation and rebuild the relationships across the EU and beyond, bringing real hope and security. Our future lies with this Labour Party being in government, healing our nation.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady for York Central. Members will have noted through the stages of this week's business a most sincere and clear lack of pleasure from the Democratic Unionist Party and what was happening. I was not pleased to learn the legal opinion of the Attorney-General was not to be made public, not pleased to learn that the Attorney-General shared my concerns regarding the undesirable features of the backstop, and I had no pleasure in the vindication of our demand for the legal opinion as a legal opinion backed up my biggest fears. It's quite clear what it says. Binding on the United Kingdom, the European Union and international law. Part 7 says Northern Ireland remains in the EU Customs Union and will apply the whole of the EU Customs Acquis. Part 8 says Northern Ireland will remain in the EU single market for goods and the EU's custom regime and will be required to apply and to comply with all the relevant rules and standards. So it's little wonder, Mr. Speaker, that my constituents in my fishing village of Portavogie are very, very clear what they always wanted for an economy. They wanted to be, less restrictions, less encumbered, less prevented from fishing in their own waters. And we have been on the front line in Portavogie and in Ardglass and Kilkeel as well, and I'd say my constituency, of the EU aggression and bureaucracy. And the insurance policies that the government ministers have said to us, they said that we really don't want this, you know, and we don't want it, they don't want it. Well, you know something, if none of us really want it, then why is it there? Here's a question I'm asking myself, you know. Why is it, no, we won't give way. Why is this almost the only thing that's ever been agreed upon? If it will not be necessary, then why have we spent 18 months discussing this and little else? Now, I'm not a fisherman by nature, Mr. Speaker, but I know cod's wallop when I see it, and that's what this is, you know. And for good measure, Mr. Speaker, I know that as well. The £340 billion as well. My goodness me, who would do that in their right mind? It's unbelievable. So what rational person, Mr. Speaker, would think that Europe, who has fought so hard for this, who have pinned all their bargaining and red line on this one insurance policy, and who have ensured that there is no legal form of leaving this international treaty without unilateral consent, will ever decide to walk away when there is no mechanism to legally compel them to come to an agreement? Not me, and let's be honest, not anyone if we're honest in this House either. Please forgive me, Mr. Speaker, I expressed some disgust and a promise made by those in this House which has been denied us, and those members and government know exactly who I'm referring to. We are small, but we are part of this wonderful United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I sincerely believe that we can and will survive the Brexit process, but only if we stand together. The Belfast Agreement clearly states that Northern Ireland remains in the UK until a majority vote to leave is gained. Northern Ireland in its entirety shall not cease to be so without the consent of the majority. And yet the Attorney-General clearly states that we are now a third country. So can this be legally acceptable? I say no. And the red line that this party has, and I've heard all our members referring to this, it's not in the red pen, it's in the blood of family members, of my cousin Kenneth Smith, of neighbours, of colleagues, of constituents, your constituents and my constituents who have shed blood to defend the right to democracy, to determine that nothing can enforce a united Ireland other than the will of the people. Government has created the potential for for an All-Ireland. And be very clear what I'm saying here. I mean this, and that's what I see the mistrust that I have for government at this moment in time. That they should draw a dust sheet over the lines drawn in the precious blood of so many that I love. This government is proposing to allow my beloved Northern Ireland to become a violated, voiceless, vetoless victim of Europe's desperate grasp for control over UK. So next Tuesday, I'm going to stand up for my people and urge other people to do the same for our own nation, for our own good. And urge government to go back to Europe with the courage of the conviction that this UK will be no one's vassal state and that Northern Ireland's blood-bought birthright is not for sale.
And Mr. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate not just my side of the House today, Mr. Speaker, but all those who've spoken in this debate, because I think that what we've shown is a testimony to the passion, but also the force of argument and rationality that members at times such as this can present the House with. I'd also like to pay tribute to you for the fact that you have shown leadership by staying in the chair the entire proceedings of this debate. But the person I'd like to start by quoting is not one of my own side. It's actually the member for East Devon. He said, "Nobody said it was going to be easy." Actually, on the 20th of July last year, the Secretary of State informed the country that an agreement with the EU would be one of the easiest in human history. Yesterday, of course I will.
If we're going to have a sensible debate and we're going to have quotes, they should be accurate and in context. As the right honourable gentleman knows, the point I was making was that the trade element, the part we have not yet negotiated with the European Union, should be simpler than most because we began, unlike in most trade agreements, with regulatory alignment and legal alignment in trade.
Yes, I know exactly what the Secretary of State said, and he also, in the following sentence, said, "Unless politics gets in the way." Clearly, politics has, but it's not the only thing that's got in the way. Yesterday, reality got in the way with the release of the Attorney General's written advice to Cabinet. The implications of this legal advice are that we could be locked into a position where the EU negotiates a new trade in goods agreement which might be beneficial for the EU but deeply disadvantageous to the UK. A deal where we have no say in the negotiations, but where the UK could be obliged to open up our markets, perhaps to the USA, without any reciprocal right of access for UK manufacturers into that US market. Now, I know the Secretary of State will have reflected carefully on that outcome. In fact, earlier this year, in his Bloomberg speech, he presaged just such a situation. Here's what he said. "As rule takers, without any say in how the rules were made, we would be in a worse position than we are today. It would be a complete sellout of Britain's national interests and a betrayal of the voters in the referendum." But in a few minutes, he'll stand at this dispatch box and urge honourable members across the House to vote for it. Mr. Speaker, I can only admire the right honourable gentleman's flexibility. So how did this mess come about? My friend, the chair of the PAC, excoriated the government for their failure to prepare. My friend from Liverpool West Derby focused on the rigidity of the Prime Minister's red lines. But perhaps the most serious error was, as my friend from Innismore and from Rutherglen said, to try to exclude Parliament from the process. To exclude us on the triggering of Article 50, on the impact assessments, on the right to a meaningful vote on the deal, on the financial modelling, and of course, we argued that Parliament had the right to see the full legal opinion prepared by the Attorney General. Their refusal was a blunder that resulted in an achievement unique in 1,000 years of our history, a government being held to be in contempt of its own Parliament. Ironic, Mr. Speaker, given that Brexit was supposed to be about the sovereignty of this Parliament. It's hardly surprising, then, that when the Prime Minister finally brings her deal back to the House of Commons, it's a deal that members on all sides now believe is not in the best interests of the country. She used to say, no deal is better than a bad deal. Now the motto seems to be, any deal is better than no deal. In fact, her deal is not actually a single deal at all. It's a package where there is one deal with binding commitments by the UK on the things that the EU demanded we settle before we leave, money, citizens' rights and the Irish border, and another proposed deal which only contains a wish list with no binding commitments on the EU on all the things the UK would like in terms of our future political, trading and security relationship. Both these are packaged up with a transition period during which the real final deal is supposed to be negotiated. People have called it a blind Brexit, because we're unable to see what we will get before we leave the EU on March the 29th, by which time we will have lost all further leverage. Is there anyone in the chamber today who, after President Macron's comments, thinks that it is mere coincidence that the final date to extend the transition period and avoid the backstop is exactly the same date as for the ratification of an agreement on access to our waters and quota shares of our fisheries? My friend from the city of Chester pointed out that the government says that currently the technology to avoid a hard border does not exist, but in a staggering act of faith believes it will be possible to achieve by December 2020, when the transition period comes to an end. And if the future relationship is not agreed by that date, the UK is faced with a stark choice: pay billions of pounds to extend the transition, or enter into the trade purgatory of the backstop arrangement. 40 years of harmonisation of standards and regulations has resulted in UK companies being deeply embedded in complex supply chains. In the past few months, I've visited factories in all sectors. I've been to the ceramics factories about which my friend from Stoke spoke so powerfully when he spoke about the unions that he'd met there and their fight, and their stressing that we must not have a no deal, whilst not exactly being enamoured with the one that's on offer. The automotive sector, what the lady will understand, that actually the purpose of summing up at the end of the day is to respond to all the comments, including hers, that have been made during the course of the debate. That's what I'll try and do. The automotive sector I visited with my honourable friend from Crewe and Nantwich. I spoke there with the management and the unions and with the workers. Their sector represents £18 billion worth of exports to the EU. It's benefited enormously from our membership, and particularly from the customs union, which has allowed companies to streamline their supply chains and employ just-in-time systems. I'm not a pessimist about the future of our country. I don't say that the UK will be poorer if we accept the Prime Minister's deal, but I say, with the support of both the Treasury and the Bank of England, that it will be much poorer than we otherwise would be, by approximately 4% of GDP. My friend from Sheffield spoke with clarity and passion about the differential impact that would have on the poorest people and on the forgotten regions of our country, which need infrastructure investment. So let's examine the potential upside. The new free trade agreement the Secretary of State is so keen for us to do, particularly our single largest bilateral trading partner, the United States. Of course, we have a trade surplus with the USA, a trade surplus that President Trump is determined to overturn. Last week, he suggested that a deal may now no longer be possible because of the way this deal is proposing to align with the EU. President Trump made it clear that a trade agreement with them would involve aligning with American regulations and standards. And yes, of course, that means chlorine-washed chicken, but it also means the US defects level handbook, which specifies the level of mice droppings or rat hairs that are permitted in your food, like 11 rodent hairs per 50 grams of cinnamon, 20 maggots per 100 grams of drained mushrooms. And if anyone in this chamber doubts it, they can read the handbook for themselves, or they can actually see what is proposed by reading Plan A+, launched by the original Brexit Secretary and by the member for North East Somerset just recently. Remove parity pay for posted workers, end limits on the hours you can be asked to work, end the precautionary principle, yes to pesticide revenues, yes to hormone-disrupting chemicals and GMOs. Such regulatory divergence from the EU would substantially impact on our ability to trade with our biggest, our closest market. It would increase the risk profile. Of course, I give way to the Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. Is he aware that because of trade asymmetries, that is the way in which trade flows are measured transatlantically, that while the United Kingdom believes that we have a trade surplus with the United States, the way the US measures trade, the US already believes it does have a trade surplus with the UK? That's his case.
Not at all, because he will have actually read what President Trump has said recently. He knows that actually the President, as a protectionist, wants to put America first, not the UK. That regulatory divergence from the EU would substantially impact on our ability to trade with our biggest and closest market. The Minister of State himself recognised the same, noting that if we come out of alignment with the EU regulations in this area, then there's a penalty to be paid in terms of frictionless trade with Europe. His own team, the Secretary of State's own team. But even assuming that new trade deals are possible without these complications, what would these new agreements contribute to our GDP? The Bank of England has quantified any benefit at less than 0.5%, just 0.2% of GDP growth. The government's own assessment says that a no-deal Brexit would result in a reduction of 9.3% of GDP. Most MPs are clear. A no-deal Brexit cannot be allowed to happen. The Prime Minister is nonetheless presenting her agreement as a binary choice between her deal and no deal. She urges MPs to vote for a deal they firmly believe is not in the country's best interest by threatening that if they don't, the consequences of no deal would be even worse. That is not an argument, it's blackmail. Most important of all, it's a false choice. Earlier today, my right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, set out an agreement that respects the key reasons why many people voted to leave: money, borders and laws, and also ensures that we continue to have frictionless trade that protects our manufacturing industries' just-in-time supply chains and the integrity of the United Kingdom. We're at a critical point in our history, and business needs certainty and stability. Our children need an optimistic future. Our country is deeply divided. I started by quoting the Secretary of State and remarking how flexible he's been in acquiescing to this deal. I conclude my remarks exhorting him to be yet more flexible still and to recall, Mr. Speaker, his own words, quoted from the Mail on Sunday on the 16th of September 2012. I believe the best way forward is for Britain to renegotiate a new relationship with the European Union, one based on an economic partnership involving a customs union and a single market in goods and services. The Secretary of State may not like it, but it sounds an awful lot like Labour Party policy to me.
Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That got a tumultuous welcome from his own benches. I'd like to thank right honourable and honourable members on both sides of the House for their valuable and insightful contributions to this debate, delivered, I have to say, with passion, but without the rancour referred to in what I may say was an elegant and wise contribution by my honourable friend, the member for Hazel Grove. And I wish that more members could have actually heard his wisdom on that subject today. Before I respond directly to some of the points, I think that this House should take a moment to consider, at this pivotal moment of our nation's history, the inherent strengths of the UK economy that we have been discussing in this debate today. At the time of the referendum itself, as my honourable friend, the member for Basildon and Billericay, mentioned in his contribution earlier today, we were told that the simple act of voting to leave the European Union, not leaving the European Union itself, but the act of voting to leave the European Union, would cause such an economic shock that we would lose 500,000 jobs, our investors would desert us, and we would require an emergency budget to deal with the ensuing fiscal imbalance. So it's worth us just considering what has actually happened in our economy in that time. We have added 700,000 jobs to the economy, with more people finding work than at any time in the past 40 years. And that is no accident. It is the result of good, conservative economic management, something that would be completely cast asunder were the Labour Party in its current hard-left form ever to take office in this country. I will in a moment. I'll come to the Honourable Lady's contributions, if I may, a little later on. This upward trajectory in employment shows no signs of slowing. Indeed, the OBR has calculated that we can add another 800,000 jobs without creating inflationary pressure, because there is still slack in the economy to do so. And Labour, throughout this debate, have talked as though post-referendum our economy is on its knees. Well, let me tell them, in 2017 we saw total UK exports rise by 10.9%, when global trade grew by about 3.4%, compared, that is, with 2016. British companies sold almost £50 billion worth of mechanical machinery, £41 billion worth of motor vehicles, £16 billion worth of aircraft and £14 billion worth of medical equipment. Since the referendum, we've increased our share of GDP that we export from 28.3% to 30.5%, a very large increase by international comparisons. So much for Britain not making anything anymore, and that's before we even consider our world-leading services sector, which accounts for around 80% of UK economic output. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman. I said I'll give way to the honourable lady later.
Very brief point. The increase in exports is recognised. The nature of the exports is recognised. Why on earth do we want to put all of that at risk by ending the ability to access those many countries with which the EU has an FTA that we are part of? Why do we put that at risk?
Well, if the honourable gentleman is serious about automatically wanting to roll over all the agreements that the European Union has, then I hope next Tuesday he will vote for the government's motion, because that's exactly what would happen if we had a withdrawal agreement and a movement into the implementation period. All those agreements would automatically be safeguarded, and he might want to think about that before he does cast his vote. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree as well to get certainty for businesses that this deal will bring, that it actually will unlock the investment that at the moment they're sitting on, and we need that investment unlocking for the future of our prosperity?
Well, indeed, as the Chancellor mentioned in his introductory speech this afternoon, that there is the potential that's widely acknowledged that when there is an agreement, then there will be a dividend because investment that may be being held back because of some uncertainty around Brexit may then come forward, and that is probably particularly true of domestic investment rather than foreign direct investment, which I will come to in just a moment. I will give way again. Unlike the Labour frontbench spokesman, I'm very happy to have a debate in the House of Commons. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the vote to leave... I heard the honourable gentleman, just calm down. Clearly, the vote to leave the European Union has not had the catastrophic effect on our economy that was predicted, quite the reverse. And it is worth making the point about the difference here between forecasts and scenarios. Throughout the debate today, I have constantly heard what were scenarios portrayed as forecasts. It's just worth pointing out that in a forecast, all the variables in an equation are considered. and the combined effect of them is then looked at and becomes a forecast. In a scenario, it's the isolation of a single factor and the assumption that if nothing else changed, then that's what may happen. Clearly, in the real world, that is not what happens. That is not realistic to expect that there would be no potential shift, if necessary, in government fiscal policy or the Bank of England's monetary policy or changes in what the government will be able to do on tariffs. So we have to be realistic and try to understand what they are, but to try to confuse what our forecasts and scenarios, intentionally or otherwise, is not actually helpful to the debate. And yes, I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Well, he's right to tell the House that George Osborne got it completely wrong on his panic measures that he was going to introduce an emergency budget, and he also got it wrong on eliminating the deficit. But the Secretary of State is laying out different scenarios. What scenario or what forecast would he like to give to the House that within X amount of time of leaving the European Union, how does he see the state of the economy?
Well, again, it's the same. It's exactly the same pattern. What we want to see is a continuation of good economic management for the United Kingdom that sees us to continue to provide jobs and prosperity in our country, record investment in the infrastructure of our country. And what we must not do, and the forecast I can give him, is that if the party opposite were ever to take office with the sort of crazy spending plans that they have, the financial and economic consequences for the prosperity of this country would truly be catastrophic.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I appreciate the positive and optimistic picture he's painting of the UK economy and our potential. Isn't it therefore demonstrating that it's always better to have a Conservative Secretary of State for International Trade talking Britain up flying around the world, rather than a Labour one talking Britain down?
Well, Mr. Speaker, talking Britain down is what you do when you cannot bear the fact that the truth tells us that our economy is doing well, that our exports are at record levels, that inward investment into the United Kingdom is at record levels, that unemployment is a record low level, employment is at a record high level. The Labour Party hate all of those facts because it goes against their basic narrative that Britain is failing and somehow needs to be rescued by an utterly inept Labour Party. I will give way to the Honourable Lady because I promised I would do so.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. I'm just slightly confused about this notion that the economy has been managed well by this government, when we have nearly the slowest growing industrialised economy in the industrialised world. We have no investment, and our GDP, our debt to GDP ratio is pretty stagnant. We are a failing economy with low wages and not the growth in terms of other industrialised nations that are way ahead of us. You are not managing the economy well.
You know, once we get out of the realms of fairy tales and actually look at the reality, the unemployment rate in the United Kingdom is 4.1%, almost exactly half of the Eurozone at 8.1%. Our exports are growing faster than most other countries in Europe, with the exception of Germany, and investment in our infrastructure is at record levels. Oh, and yes, now that he wants to come into the debate, I'm very well glad to.
As indeed I allowed him to twice. Would he confirm whether he's actually seen Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs regional trade and goods stats for the third quarter that were published this morning, which show that all regions of the United Kingdom are importing more than they're exporting, and we therefore have a large balance of trade deficit?
I hate to bring this to the Honourable Gentleman's attention. It no doubt will come as a shock, but we've had a trade deficit since the 1980s. In fact, one of the few times we've not had was in February this year, when the UK actually became a net exporter for the first time in some time. Again, of course, the Honourable Gentleman would no doubt will be overlooking those facts because they don't suit his narrative. Now, I'll give way tomorrow, right? And then I shall make some progress, much as I'm enjoying it.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and can I pay tribute to the work that he's done in talking to our trading partners around the world in contemplation of having new trade agreements once we're into the implementation period. And does he agree with me? One of the strengths of the deal the Prime Minister's negotiated is that we can do that. We can go into the implementation period, we can negotiate, ratify, sign these trade deals ready to go. But if we don't take this deal and we just fall out of the EU, we won't get that chance. So it's very important we do.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right, and it's certainly true that in the draft political declaration, it was not as favourable to an independent trade policy as the final declaration itself was, given the changes that the United Kingdom insisted upon in that particular negotiation. And I have to say that I was much heartened by those changes, not least because, in terms of talking about customs cooperation, it talks upon building upon and improving, not just building upon, and it cross-references the other elements of that to include protection of our independent trade policy. Of course, I'll give way to my honourable friend if he still wants to give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Can I refer him on the issue of forecasts and scenarios to Open Europe's excellent report published this week, which is clear that the gains from artificial intelligence over the next 10-15 years will more than outweigh any conceivable loss from any scenario surrounding our exit.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I can say that my honourable friend is right. In all scenarios, that was correct. And so the doom and gloom that is being pushed in some quarters is not consistent with the reality of Britain's economic performance. I think, Mr. Speaker, now is the time to raise our sights and acknowledge that there is a world beyond Europe and there will be a time beyond Brexit. I will give way to the honourable gentleman in a moment. The referendum settled the question of our departure from the European Union. This House voted overwhelmingly to hold that referendum. The British people voted on the understanding that we would enact that result. In 2016, we didn't have a consultation with the British public. We were given an instruction to negotiate this country's withdrawal from the European Union. A point that was made in powerful speeches by my honourable friends, the member for North Hertfordshire, Tunbridge and Malling, West Worcestershire, Berwick-upon-Tweed and Stafford, amongst others, all coming from different parts of the political debate. A clear indication that we have to find a compromise that makes this workable. And they're on the table. It has been painstakingly negotiated by both sides. And of course, we haven't got every single thing that we wanted, but then again, neither did the EU, which is the nature of international agreements. It is a compromise, as I have to say was pointed out by my right honourable friend, the member for Mid Sussex, in what I thought was an outstanding, if I may say, an outstanding personal and passionate speech, the likes of which we would love to hear more of in this House. It was a message echoed by my honourable friends for Edinburgh and Ashford. And do I think that the agreement is perfect? No, I don't. Did I think it would be perfect? No, I didn't. But does it do enough to get us out of the European Union? Yes, it does. And for those who want another referendum, let's just be very clear that the one thing that will not be on offer in any further referendum, as was not on offer at the last referendum, is to get the status quo. The status quo has never been on offer. This is a dynamic progression in the European Union. The EU is committed, as it has been since the Treaty of Rome, to ever closer union. And we wish our European friends well in this endeavour, but it is not the right course for Britain. And we must be free from the one-way ratchet of federalism, as my right honourable friend for South Dorset said in his very powerful intervention. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, for giving way. It was Samuel Johnson who observed that nothing so concentrates the mind like a hanging. And as the gallows are being built next Tuesday for this withdrawal bill, can the Secretary of State confirm if there are any discussions taking place about putting this motion off or about altering it in any way, or are they fixed, is the government fixed to working towards those gallows?
Speaker, the Government will continue to make the case for what it believes is a balanced and reasonable agreement. But of course, the Government will want to talk to members. Of course, it will want to look to ways to give a reassurance to the House wherever we're able to do that. But we, under this agreement, will be, I will give way to my friend. I'm sorry, I just couldn't see her. We will be free to decide for ourselves who comes to the UK, free to decide who fishes in our waters, free to decide how to support our farmers, free to open new markets around the world to the best that Britain produces, free to consider new ideas such as the free ports that my honourable friend, the member for Cleethorpes, outlined today. Above all else, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration provides what members on both sides were calling for business, and that's stability and certainty, a firm foundation on which to continue to operate across the EU, which remains one of the most important of our export markets. I give way to my friend.
Thank you for giving way. The party opposite seemed to suggest they wanted to tear up the withdrawal agreement and go and negotiate something different with Brussels. Does he agree with me that all trade agreements take time to negotiate, and this withdrawal agreement gives us the breathing space to finalise that trade agreement, and tearing it up is irresponsible?
Mr. Speaker, one thing that perhaps has not been fully understood in the public domain as a result of the complexities around Brexit is that it doesn't matter what model you want to have as the future partnership. We have to have a withdrawal agreement if there's to be any continuity. And that is part of the Article 50 process. We have to have a withdrawal agreement with a view to the future relationship that we will have. And that is where the backstop comes in. The Irish government in particular made it very clear that they would not be willing to contemplate a withdrawal agreement unless it had certain guarantees which are embodied in the backstop. Now, just on that subject, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear, and I entirely understand why many of my colleagues do not like the concept of the backstop as it's constructed. And I have to say I share, as does the Prime Minister, many of those same anxieties. And it comes down to a question of trust, and it comes down, as the Attorney General said in his evidence to the House the other day, on a balance of risks. But it is worth saying that there are many in this House who have made very clear throughout the day today that they didn't trust the European Union to release Britain from the backstop. And that is a big worry that many of my colleagues share. But it's equally true to say, if you cross the channel to the other side, that there are those who take the view, which I understand is very difficult for some in this House to grasp, they take the view that this is a great and wily move on behalf of the United Kingdom, because it could, if it doesn't get what it wants in the future economic partnership, could park itself in the backstop, not making any financial contribution, not having free movement, but having access to the single market. And there are those in other countries who say, why should our taxpayers pay for the UK to have that privilege? And it is very difficult for the Commission to say, what do we tell Norway and Switzerland, who do have to pay for that privilege of access to the single market? So we do try to have to try to understand that it does work in both directions, difficult though that may be conceptually for us. I will give way to my honourable friend.
It's grateful to my honourable friend. My honourable friend and I have had many face-to-face talks. This is not a wily move by the United Kingdom. This is a deal that will allow the United Kingdom to leave the EU. The backstop, very clearly, and we've heard it from the Attorney General, means we may not be allowed to leave unilaterally, stuck in it. It's not a wily move, and the compromise down the middle deal has upset everybody. We need the unilateral right to leave this institution as the people of this country instructed us to do.
Well, it's certainly true that there has been some movement on this issue. Originally, it was envisaged that the backstop had to be permanent. Now, in the agreement, it's clear that it's designed to be a temporary measure. And I think that what we should also understand is that the whole concept of the backstop, if we don't like it here, we do have to understand it's also not liked or in continental Europe. That should be the biggest incentive that we have to never get there and actually reach a trade agreement on our future partnership. Now, I would just say, I will give way to the honourable gentleman, of course. I was struck by the contribution of my honourable friend, the member for Morecambe and Lonsdale today, who did make the point, and it's worth reflecting upon, that had David Cameron come back and brought this country a deal that said you can be outside the single market, outside the customs union, outside the common fisheries policy, outside the common agricultural policy, make no contribution and end free movement. I wonder what the reaction would have been at that point in history had he brought that agreement back, and that is the agreement that we're talking about here today. I know that I, for one, would have been biting his right hand off for an agreement like that at that time. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Minister, in December 2017, I asked the Prime Minister a question, and it was and her reply to me when I sought an assurance from the Prime Minister, I am very clear that we will not be a member of the single market or the customs union. We are not proposing that any part of the United Kingdom will be a member of the single market or the customs union separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. The whole of the United Kingdom, that's Northern Ireland, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, will be out of the internal market and the customs union. So you can understand why when we see the legal agreement which says something completely different, why I greatly mistrust what I'm told by people from government at this moment in time.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the government has the best interests of the whole of the Union at heart, which is why, for example, when we're negotiating trade agreements, they are for the whole of the United Kingdom and not partial. The issue was raised yesterday at the Select Committee about whether the government would therefore implement during the backstop any trade agreement with the rest of the United Kingdom but not with Northern Ireland. And I think that would be very difficult to justify exactly on the terms that he mentioned. Now, one of the most interesting speeches of the day, Mr. Speaker, was that of the Shadow Chancellor. In reply to my honourable friend, the member for North Antrim, who might not want to leave right at the moment, he said the backstop would not be needed under Labour's plans because there would be a customs union. This is patently untrue. The regulatory gradient that would exist would not remove the need for a border and would address neither the anxieties of the Irish government nor those of us in the United Kingdom who believe in the integrity of the Union. He said Labour would negotiate a comprehensive customs union and they will have a say in future trade agreements. Well, let me tell the right honourable gentleman what a nonsense that is. Under EU law, the EU has exclusive competence over its common commercial policy, which includes trade agreements under Article 207. The EU treaties set out clear provisions for concluding EU FTAs, which provide a role for EU member states and the European Parliament. These treaty provisions do not permit a non-EU member state, even one in a customs union specifically with the EU, to play a decision-making role in concluding EU trade agreements. Nonsense. It was another piece of ill-conceived Labour fantasy. What we have heard today from the Labour Party front bench is an ill-researched, ill-understood, unrealistic and incredible policy. Labour, as we all know, on this issue, and to the great irritation of their socialist allies across Europe, is simply playing politics with the issue, and at a time of great national decision-making, they are out of their depth and not up to the task.
I appreciate the Secretary giving way. Just on the backstop issue that he seems to have skirted when challenged on this a number of times, the letter that was sent to members from the Attorney-General was very clear. The protocol, including Article 19, does not provide for a mechanism that's likely to enable the UK to lawfully exit the UK-wide customs union without a subsequent agreement, and that remains the case even if
negotiations have broken down. So the points that have been made are accurate. And the Secretary has managed to skirt around that without answering it directly. So answer it directly.
No, I answered the question. What I was actually concentrating on was excoriating the Labour Party for the policy that they set out this afternoon, a policy which is delusional because it does nothing that they actually claim it does. And to the irritation of the European Union, the Shadow Chancellor and his team don't even appear to understand the European law that they're praying in aid for their own ridiculous case.
I say to the honourable gentleman, the right honourable gentleman, do not judge our ability to negotiate on the basis of the incompetence his party has shown for 2 years.
Okay. Perhaps the right honourable gentleman can tell the House, I'll give him the opportunity, under which articles of European treaty does it allow a non-EU member to have a say? Under which treaty? For those members who can't lip read, it appears that the Shadow Chancellor was saying that he would single-handedly be able to rewrite EU treaties to be able to accommodate Labour Party policy. What a shambles of an approach to a national negotiation. Mr. Speaker, let me just deal with a couple of other issues that were raised in the debate, if I may. My right honourable friend, the member for Yeovil, raised an issue yesterday at the Select Committee which I would like to specifically address. He was concerned that the backstop rules would bind the UK to EU state aid rules. And I understand that he was specifically concerned about the defence sector, which has a major role in his own constituency. And I'm happy to inform that, having taken advice, under the backstop, the UK would still have an exemption from state aid rules in respect of defence measures. One of the themes, Mr. Speaker, today that I really feel I have to deal with is the constant refrain from the Labour benches that they were talking about the causes that led people to vote leave. They talked about everything except that people were unhappy with membership of the European Union. And we got the same condescension, the same patronising attitudes. People voted to leave the European Union because after 40 years of experience, moving from the common market into the European Union with greater and greater politicisation and moving away from the concept of an economic union, they didn't like it. They didn't like someone having legal authority over them. They didn't like someone else determining how to spend their money or someone else determining their borders. We need to be very clear about some of the alternatives being foot. My honourable member for Gloucester, my honourable friend, the member for Gloucester, and I won't give away again, was very clear that we have to beware of some of the siren voices about other alternatives, particularly the EEA-EFTA option. We would pay highly for such an option. We would have to negotiate membership from outside the EU. The EU members, as well as the EFTA members, would all have to agree such a membership. We would have full regulatory alignment inside the single market and have less freedom on future trade agreements than we have under the agreement being put forward by the government. We would be hamstrung by rules on our financial services, not even able to set the rules in our own city, and we would have full freedom of movement applied to us. It could not be further than what the public voted for in the referendum. Mr. Speaker, I won't give way again. Mr. Speaker, the government has made clear that we want to take a balanced approach to the question of our future trading prospects. We acknowledge the need to maximise our access to the EU market, but without damaging our potential to benefit from the emerging trade opportunities in other parts of the world. And I remind the House that the International Monetary Fund has said that 90% of global growth in the next 5 years, bringing their forecast forward, will occur outside continental Europe. Ambitious arrangements have been made in the political declaration for services and investment crucial to this country, arrangements that go well beyond WTO commitments and build on the most ambitious of the EU's recent FTAs. But we've also been clear that our future relationship with the EU would recognise the development of an independent UK trade policy and not tie our hands when it comes to global opportunities. The 27 nations of the European Union constitute some of our largest trading partners. As a whole, some 44% of this country's exports of goods and services still go to the European Union, although that proportion has diminished somewhat over the past decade or so. We have set out an approach which means the UK would be able to set its own trade policy with the rest of the world, including, and let me be very clear, setting our own tariffs, implementing our own trade remedies, and taking up our own independent seat at the World Trade Organization. And it's at the World Trade Organization and in like bodies where proper global liberalisation is likely to take place, and in an economy that is 80% services orientated, it is the liberalisation globally of services that will have a far greater impact on the future prosperity of the United Kingdom than anything that is likely to be done on a bilateral agreement in goods, which has largely been liberalised over the past 20 or so years. Britain is well prepared for a global future, and no other country has the same combination of fundamental strengths that will allow us to thrive in an age where knowledge and expertise are the instigators of success. And the inward investment into this country in recent months is testament to that. Not only have we maintained our place in global FDI, we've improved it. According to the UN, in the first 6 months of 2018, Britain was second only to China and ahead of the United States in terms of inward investment because of the strong economic fundamentals of this country that have been set down since 2010 by Conservative government. Our export and investment performance show that the sceptics have been wrong and that Britain is flourishing. The divisions of the referendum now need to be consigned to the past. It is time to set aside our differences and lead our country to a future of freedom, success and prosperity. But let, Mr. Speaker, us be clear about one thing. There are those who claim, and it has been claimed today, that Parliament can override the result of the referendum because Parliament is sovereign. And I say this to them. On this particular issue, Parliament subcontracted its sovereignty to the British people when it said we cannot or will not make a decision on this particular matter. We want the people to take this decision and issue an instruction to Parliament. The people of this country made that decision and issued that instruction. If we want to retain the public's faith in our democratic institutions, it is time for Parliament to live up to our side of the bargain. In politics, Mr. Speaker, we cannot always have the luxury of doing what we want for ourselves, but we always have an abiding duty to do what is right for our country. I commend this motion to the House.
Order. The question is that the debate be now adjourned. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Debate to be order in a moment. Debate to be resumed what day? Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. Point of order, Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, earlier I intervened on the honourable member for Dundee East to make a point about the difference in sentencing by courts of EU nationals and those from other countries. I want to make it clear, Mr. Speaker, that I intended no disrespect to European nationals, but I made the point clumsily. I illustrated it clumsily, and therefore I want to apologise to anyone who took offence, which I promised the House was absolutely not intended.
I fully understand the purport of what the honourable gentleman has had to say, and I think that he has set the record straight. It's not for me to act as arbiter of the merit or demerit of what a particular honourable member says, and each member takes responsibility for his or her own observations. However, in the circumstances which the honourable gentleman described to me briefly some little while ago at the chair, I quite understand why he wanted to say what he has just said. And I thank him for doing so, and I think it will be noted and appreciated by colleagues. Yes, a point of order, Mr. Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the beginning of the debate we've just had, you made it very clear that it was expected that members that participated in the debate would attend the chamber for wind-up speeches. Mr. Speaker, if I have misjudged this, I will apologise, withdraw and sit down accordingly, but there was one member who spoke for well in advance of 20 minutes in this debate, who subsequently never returned for the wind-up speeches. That was in excess of 5 times as long as backbenchers got. If there's a good reason, I will apologise and withdraw. If there is no good reason, how might this be placed on the record so that my dissatisfaction, which I think is shared by many on my side of the House, can be recorded?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. He's entirely correct in recalling what I said at the outset of the debate. That was a repeat of what I had said yesterday that could brook of no misunderstanding. Off the top of my head, and I don't think it's proper to air it here on the floor of the House anyway, I'm not sure to whom he is referring, but suffice it to say, unless there is a peculiarly compelling reason why somebody has to absent him or herself and therefore not to be present for the wind-up speeches, members who choose to speak in a debate should then be present for the wind-up speeches. The honourable gentleman has registered his point with some force and obvious sincerity, and I respect what he has said. Very well. Point of order, Jim Shannon.
Speaker, how do we put on record or on order our thanks to you, Mr. Speaker, for your perseverance for 3 days of doing these debates, and I have to say, Mr. Speaker, for an incredible bladder, mine would never be as good as yours.
Well, yeah, I'm extraordinarily obliged to the honourable gentleman for what he's just said. As far as I'm concerned, it's a great honour and privilege to occupy this chair. The matter that we have been discussing is perhaps the most important and momentous subject that we have debated in decades, and it may well prove to be the single most important issue that we will discuss here in the course of our careers. So for me as Speaker to seek to ensure that the maximum number of colleagues can participate and to have the opportunity to listen to all points of view is, as I say, an honour and a privilege. So I don't look for any thanks, but the honourable gentleman is characteristically gracious, and I accept his warm remarks in the spirit in which they are intended. Thank you. We come now... The right honourable gentleman is quite fortunate. He's making 2 orations in the course of a day. He may have made orations outside the House as well, I don't know. But certainly in the Chamber, this will be his second oration. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Sir Hugo Swire.
And now for something completely different, Mr. Speaker. I had hoped that perhaps more colleagues would have wanted to stay for this important debate and would in fact be rather envious of seahorses who go about their business in the bottom of the ocean, completely ignorant, perhaps, of regulatory borders, backstops and barriers to trade. Perhaps they've never even heard of Brexit at all, or the withdrawal bill. And so we must envy them in that respect. But, Mr. Speaker, seahorses are a unique marine creature. Swimming upright in a manner unlike other fish, they change colour like chameleons, with an eponymous head and neck featuring segmented bony armour. For those members grounded in the classics, and I'm sure of the few members in this chamber, there are at least 1 or 2 of them, for those members grounded in the classics, their genus stems from the ancient Greek hippocampos, meaning horse sea monster. Such a translation, Mr. Speaker, would belie their elegance, gracefulness and mythical persona, many only an inch or 2 long. In practical terms, they range in size from a pine nut to a banana. Art and cultural works depicted the hippocampus quite literally as a sea horse, half sea monster, from the lampposts of Dublin to the Trevi Fountain in Rome. Surely these delicate creatures are the cultural and artistic prism through which our fascination with the seas and oceans has been magnified. Of course,
for giving way. I always rehearse these things and research them as well. And my research, the very honourable member, what I have been aware of is that there are some 33 known species of seahorse being classified as vulnerable. And in 2002, there were reports of millions of seahorses, as many as that, being taken out of the sea, put in the sun to dry, out in a slow and painful death, and used as jewellery. Does the honourable gentleman feel that something needs to be done with China to prevent these seals and what they're doing?
Well, clearly I do, which is why I'm having this debate. But the honourable gentleman has uniquely not managed to mention Strangford Lough in his intervention. I'm sure there are some seahorses there, or there were at some point. But he makes his point well, and I'll be coming to that in just a minute or two. Seahorses play an important role in coastal ecosystems, eating small crustaceae such as Mysis shrimp up to a remarkable 50 times a day. The seahorse is both a highly adapted predator and, in turn, it is preyed upon in very large numbers. Unusually, the male seahorse gives birth to thousands of fry per annum. Sadly, out of every 2,000 born, only 1 or 2 survive to maturity. They fulfil a role of maintaining the checks and balances of our natural ecosystem. Without them, one more brick in the wall of nature would be gone. The British coastline is home to 2 species, the spiny seahorse, occasionally known as the long-snouted seahorse, which Hansard will have to confirm is the Hippocampus gutulatus, and the short-snouted seahorse, Hippocampus hippocampus. They are not as widespread across our isles as many may assume, and are to be found predominantly in an arc stretching from the Shetland Isles down the west coast to the south coast of England. Sightings on the east coast, North Sea and across the Channel in our dear ally and neighbour France are far more sporadic. In July last year, Mr. Speaker, it was widely reported that the short-snouted seahorse was discovered in my part of the world off the coast of Devon, a species more commonly found in balmy waters of the Mediterranean and southwest of the Isles of Scilly. Having said that, they are indeed indigenous, and we should be very pleased and protective of them, and pleased and proud that they are an important part of the natural ecosystem of the British Isles. Tragically, the traditional medicine, curio and aquarium trades are threatening the future of seahorses. We know that 25 to 65 million seahorses per year are taken from seas and oceans across the world. However, these are official figures based on what might be termed the official trade. Environmental groups estimate in excess of 150 million per year are killed based on counts during undercover operations. Now, all species of seahorse are protected under the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, though the illegal trade overshadows the legal trade by a greater margin. Before I proceed further, I would expect that those members watching or attending this debate and the public watching at home would probably blame their demise on traditional Chinese medicine, where they are purported to be an aphrodisiac and a combat against common ailments. However, by some estimates, the curio trade and traditional Chinese medicine take roughly the same number from the wild. Both are devastating, cruel trades that have far-reaching consequences worldwide. You might see them ground up in dodgy medicines or as souvenirs in seaside markets. Along with shells and starfish, they are deliberately taken from the sea, and as the honourable gentleman said earlier, are left to die in the boiling sun. I could not imagine a more unpleasant way of death. Yet what we do in this country can protect the seahorses around our coasts and islands and further afield. The illegal trade is truly international, so I'm not suggesting that all the seahorses circulating in UK marketplaces and shops are harvested from our shores, far from it. Indeed, the 2 species found off our coasts are some of the most threatened of all species in the UK. You are far more likely to find these creatures imported in shipping containers hidden amongst other licensed goods from Malaysia or the seas of China, where they are far more abundant. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, should we not be asking how we can take international leadership in protecting them rather than wagging our finger at other countries? My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, asserted at a reading of the Ivory Bill in the Commons that the UK would affirm global leadership on ivory sales, demonstrating our belief that the abhorrent ivory trade should become a thing of the past. While the seahorse trade is regulated rather than prohibited, I know my right honourable friend is no less enthusiastic to do what we can to ensure that seahorses not just survive, but can thrive within our fragile ecological wall. The debate this evening is not about our existing regulatory framework. It is about enforcement, practice rather than theory. There is no case where a CITES permit is not required for export, import, re-export or re-import of any seahorse, alive or dead, in part or as a whole. And as such, all seahorses require a CITES permit and authorisation by a scientific management authority. Now, of course, questions remain as to whether police, wildlife crimes officers, the Animal, Plant and Health Authority and Customs and Excise have adequate resources to carry out enforcement of existing regulations. So will the Minister, my friend the Minister, agree to look again at the resources required to support these agencies? Fundamentally, I believe we must tackle the ease with which one can purchase seahorses illegally online. The whole struggle is that online platforms, including social media companies, are not insisting that CITES evidence is uploaded with the product listing. One major platform insists that they are not responsible for what their sellers do, or what their sellers sell. So brazen are traders in seahorses that they do not even need to go onto the dark web, though the dark web is not something I'm over familiar with, Mr. Speaker, nor would you be, but they have to go onto the dark web. And online platforms police themselves across their sales, as one would expect. When seahorse products are reported to them, they generally remove the listings. However, some major online platforms are not responding to customer reports of illegal sales. To have one central place that we can report illegal sales will be much more efficient in bringing about prosecutions of repeat offenders. This could be a portal that would also provide authorities a central pool of data to monitor trends across websites and areas of the United Kingdom. So my suggestion is that the government should evaluate the effectiveness of existing statutory regulations in allowing the fining and prosecution of online platforms illegally trading in seahorses. Mr. Speaker, I would therefore call on the government, through the Minister, to encourage the reporting of illegal listings to online platforms by publishing straightforward guidance for the public, social media and other online marketplace companies. I was delighted to meet with the excellent environmental charity, the Seahorse Trust, based in the beautiful Topsham in my constituency of East Devon. I know they are eagerly following this debate and are very grateful that I've managed to secure it, and they are with anticipation waiting to hear the Minister's response, as indeed we all are. The Seahorse Trust is responsible for overseeing and working in partnership with a number of research projects around the world through a loose collection of seahorse groups called the Seahorse Alliance. They are a small organisation, punching well above their weight in getting the plight of the seahorse noticed by regulators, online marketplaces and the general public. I'm sure that the Minister would like to pass on how delighted they were to have the opportunity to bring their concerns before the Secretary of State earlier this year when I took them to see him in his offices at DEFRA. Mr. Speaker, I would like to end, indeed you would like me to end, I have no doubt. You've been in the chair for all day, it's absolutely staggering. But I'd like to end by saying that now is the time. We're doing it in many other areas of wildlife, and we're doing a great job. This government is doing a tremendous job, but it is now time to show leadership on this particular trade, on the illegal trade in seahorses, by targeting how they are traded, while simultaneously ensuring that those tasked with policing the trade are resourced so to do. Mr. Speaker, we simply cannot keep chipping away at our fragile ecological wall and expect to get away with it.
I call the Minister George Eustace to reply to the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to begin by congratulating my right honourable friend, the member for East Devon, for securing this debate and for his support for the protection of seahorses, which are undoubtedly one of our most unusual and beautiful fish. He's most eloquently described their unique nature and their role in coastal ecosystems. And I would also like to join him in paying tribute to the work done by the Seahorse Trust and others to raise awareness of their plight. Whilst only 2 species inhabit UK waters between Shetland and to Devon, there are over 50 species that inhabit many of the shallower coastal waters across the globe. And as my right honourable friend said, they are unlike most other fish, not only in the way that they look, but also in the way that they live. And this extends to their reproduction, where it is the males that unusually take on eggs from the female, and then take responsibility both for giving birth to young seahorses and then raising those young. Seahorses do not, however, differ from other species of fish in the pressures that they face and the threats to their survival. Seahorses are caught for the aquarium and traditional medicine trades, or sometimes simply for their trade as curiosities. They are also affected by pressures on their environment, such as habitat loss, and they can be affected as well as bycatch of fishing activities targeted at other species. Trade in seahorses to the UK is mainly in live animals, with the majority of these having been bred in captivity. Between 2010 and 2015, the UK imported around 21,300 live seahorses, which had been bred in captivity, and 1,700 live wild seahorses. Now, as I said earlier, in UK waters there are two species of seahorse present, the short-snouted seahorse and the long-snouted seahorse. The short-snouted seahorse and both long-snouted seahorse are both listed on the OSPAR list of threatened or declining species and habitats. And as a contracting party to OSPAR, we are committed to taking measures to protect them. Both native seahorse species have a wide distribution around the UK and are found all around the British Isles and Ireland, up into the Shetland Islands. Seahorses feed mainly on very small marine crustaceans, and adult seahorses can eat between 65 to 70 per day, whereas the fry eat up to 3,000 plankton-sized bits of food every 24 hours. And seahorses are often taken by predatory fish, and they have to rely on their camouflage to avoid detection, since they are also poor swimmers. The protection of endangered species around the world is a key priority for this government. The well-being of our society depends on a healthy environment, and that requires policies to deliver healthy ecosystems, global biodiversity, and the conservation of species. My right honourable friend can be assured that we are taking action, bilaterally and through international agreements, to protect wildlife populations both around the UK and further afield, whether they are threatened by poaching, habitat loss, or unsustainable use. The United Kingdom is rightly recognised as a global leader on environmental issues, whether by raising the illegal wildlife trade up the international agenda, or through our commitment to tackling climate change, deforestation, and ocean acidification. At home in our waters, we are providing increasing levels of protection to marine life, including seahorses, through the designation of marine conservation zones. They provide a means of protecting seabed habitats and the species that live on and in the seabed, such as seagrass beds and the seahorses that live in them. We have so far designated 50 marine conservation zones, some of them such as Torbay and Beachy Head West, with the specific objective of protecting seahorses. We have consulted on a third tranche of marine conservation zones, where we have proposed to designate a further 41 sites. Some of these, such as Studland Bay, Beachy Head East, and Bembridge, will again specifically protect seahorse populations. And we expect decisions on third tranche site designations by June next year. As with illegal trade, we are also working to protect marine species on a global scale. The UK and our 14 overseas territories are custodians of the 5th largest marine estate in the world, and we have committed to create a blue belt to protect and conserve around 4 million square kilometres of waters around the overseas territories. Seahorses also receive protection through the UK's Wildlife and Countryside Act and through the listing of seahorses under CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Trade in seahorses is indeed regulated rather than prohibited. In the UK, it is an offence to trade in species of seahorse native to the UK, unless there is evidence that the seahorses have been captive bred. Where there is illegal trade in seahorses, for example, where there is no evidence that the specimens were legally imported, we can prosecute under the Control of Trade in Endangered Species regulations. Thankfully, in the UK, seizures of seahorses at our borders are few and far between. In the last calendar year, there have been 14 in total, and none have been of significant nature. These have been primarily traditional medicine products of which seahorses were identified as a component. And as we have heard, though, protections are only as effective as the enforcement behind them. And I can tell my right honourable friend that there was a conviction in 2014 at Bromley for an offence of selling a product using seahorses, and there was a fine attached to that. There was a further case in 2015 of someone being cautioned. And of those 14 seizures that I mentioned, one involved 5 live seahorses for the marine trade, where there were permit errors identified. One seizure was of 13 dried seahorses that were part of a Chinese medicinal package. And there were 12 seizures of pills, where seahorses were identified as being one of the medicinal ingredients. We recognise the importance of tackling wildlife crime and have therefore increased funding for the National Wildlife Crime Unit to provide intelligence and support for local police forces. The unit that plays an important role in supporting police forces to detect and prevent wildlife crime, including the illegal trade in seahorses, has, for instance, acted on information from the Seahorse Trust, which my right honourable friend mentioned, on potential illegal activity. Nevertheless, my right honourable friend has suggested that we should evaluate the effectiveness of the protections in place already, and he will therefore be pleased to know that we made such a commitment when we hosted the Illegal Wildlife Trade Conference in London in October. We committed there to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of preventative and criminal justice responses and other measures related to the protection and monitoring of wildlife and forest products. This will be undertaken by the International Consortium for Combating Wildlife Crime in the coming months and will help to identify any shortcomings in the current regulatory regime. More generally, with respect to the illegal wildlife trade, government has a strong record of leadership in this area, and the UK is at the forefront of international efforts to protect endangered animals and plants from unsustainable and illegal trade. This trade is not limited to certain countries or regions. It is a truly global phenomenon affecting plants, animals, fish, birds and insects, and the government is committed to tackling all of these elements. We're committed to working with our international partners around the world to tackle this growing problem, and our response has to rest on an international cooperation, and it is working with other nations to reduce demand and disrupt this crime that we will truly make a difference. To support these efforts, we are investing £36 million to try to reduce demand, strengthen law enforcement, and develop sustainable livelihoods. We need to eradicate the market for illegal wildlife products, ensure our laws are strong enough to deter the criminals, rigorously enforce those laws, and provide sustainable livelihoods for those who might otherwise be tempted by the short-term gains of poaching. Now, my right honourable friend raised the trade in endangered species being facilitated online, and we know that this can present particular challenges. And that is why we are working closely with the private sector across the transport, financial, tourism, cyber and technology sectors to increase the levels of ambition and commitment by businesses to assist us in tackling the illegal wildlife trade. Recently, there have been some significant steps taken forward. In particular, the Global Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online has brought together the world's biggest e-commerce, technology and social media companies to join forces in shutting down online marketplaces for wildlife traffickers. NGOs and global companies such as eBay, Google, Microsoft and Facebook are working to unite the industry and maximise the impact for reducing wildlife trafficking online. They are committed to reducing wildlife trafficking across online platforms by 80% by 2020. And the related Global Wildlife Cybercrime Action Plan also includes commitments from its partners to work with companies to ensure that policies and reporting mechanisms for customers and users are easy to access and user-friendly. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I believe we've had a very important debate, an important, a different conclusion to the debate we've been having all day about Brexit. It does show that there is more to life than Brexit. The plight of our seahorses that my right honourable friend has highlighted is important. And I hope I've been able to reassure him of the seriousness with which the government takes this issue, the steps that we've taken, and the global action that we are taking to tackle this particular challenge.
Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.